News of the Times. Favourite British Edwardian murder tales. The Crime Compilation Special. Welcome to News of the Times. In today's end of month special, we explore some of the team's favourite Edwardian episodes that we have done over the last year or so. We have included stories from England, Wales and Ireland, a true British compilation. Case 1. The WARLEY Gap Murder, 1903. This case is memorable from the utter brutality of it. Taking place in Essex at the beautiful WARLEY Gap location, a young girl is so brutally beaten she is unrecognisable. Additional horrendous acts perpetrated upon her body with a stick make the police believe that the perpetrator must be a madman. Case 2. The Moat Farm Mystery, 1903. This famous case takes place in a remote farm in Essex in 1903. What begins as a simple fraud case rapidly spirals into a murder case complete with a notorious cad, numerous illicit relations, and a body dumped into a sewage drain next to the farm that remains undiscovered for some 4 years. Case 3. The mother-in-law murder in Armagh, Ireland in 1905. This very strange case is memorable just because of the odd way it unfolds. A man sitting in a cell accused of rape tells prison officials that he has had a dream that his wife and sister killed his mother. His mother had passed several months before, and investigations into his dream unfold a truly bizarre case of murder. Case 4. The scandalous murder of William Whiteley in 1907. For the non-British, the Whiteley chain of department stores was arguably the British version of Woolworths. It was a very famous name in its time. This case absolutely shocked the country, involving the murder of the founder of the empire by one of his many, many illegitimate children. Case 5. The Regent Square Murder, Scotland Yard Casebook, 1917. Purists will correctly inform us that 1917 is not strictly Edwardian. It is, however, gathered under the appellation of Edwardian style up to 1919, so we include it here. This remains one of our favourite, not only because the crime itself is so unusual, but the Scotland Yard detective work is also quite impressive. A London sweeper in a rather posh neighbourhood discovers a bundle of disjointed corpses with heads and hands missing, but Scotland Yard prevail nonetheless. Case 6. The murder of Mabel Greenwood in 1919. The wonderful case from Wales is the classic did he or didn't he case involving Scotland Yard. Mabel Greenwood, heiress, becomes unwell and unexpectedly dies. Her husband, who is considered a bit of a shady character, although outwardly terribly upset by his beloved wife's passing, marries a much younger model 4 months later. This case also involved the famous and celebrated Sir Edward Marshall for the defence, but will that be enough to get him off? Further particulars. A new initiative we began in 2024 was the end of episode further particulars segment, incorporation of curious stories collected in the British and international papers. Our vast collection of these stories are sometimes long, sometimes shorter, but all of them are definitely odd. We generally try to tie the story to each episode either by theme or by time. In today's episode, we bring in the famous story from 1909 of the Lamberhurst ghost as investigated by a Daily Mail reporter. We hope you have your drink ready. We are partial to tea. It's a British thing. and we are quite sure this episode also requires biscuits at the very least and a comfy chair. We really hope you enjoy the show. Case 1. The WARLEY Gap Murder, 1903. This horrific crime took place in the ruggedly beautiful area of WARLEY Gap, just outside Brentwood in Essex, in 1903. 19-year-old Maud Garrett, respectable daughter of a bricklayer, had been found so severely beaten that she is unrecognisable. She is identified by her father, with whom she lives, by her clothing. The additional wounds incurred to her involving a stick are so shocking in nature, the initial reaction by police is that the perpetrator must be mad. The case shocked the community and was also something of a scandal, as it was the home of the Essex 2nd Division. As Great Britain, seeing the international tensions in Europe, had begun to increase its army reserves. Background. WARLEY Gap in 1903 was a beautiful, rugged terrain of woodland located near Brentwood. The area was the home of the Essex 2nd Regiment. With the increasingly tense political situation within Europe, the government was busy expanding its military force. The establishment of the Essex 2nd Regiment was one such new military base. Within the community, Maud Garrett lived with her father. Her mother had died some years previously. Maud kept house for her father, who worked as a bricklayer. Soldiers now came into town, and Maud met a young private named Bernard White in 1902. The two would take walks together, what would be construed as an Edwardian form of dating. White was sent away for a tour in South Africa, and it would seem that White was not a keen letter writer, and contact between the two drifted. Maud, in the meantime, became acquainted with a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps named Cecil B. Jones. They began taking walks and seeing each other regularly. There are reports stating that the two were engaged. If this is so, her father knew nothing about it. White, however, returns and seems to be under the impression that he is betrothed to Maud. He knows nothing of her relationship with Private Jones, who, at the time of White's return, is in hospital due to illness. White and Maud bump into each other in town by accident. The two make an appointment to meet the following evening. From the Bournemouth Daily Echo, the 23rd of May, 1903, suspected brutal murder. Girl's dead body found. The body of a girl was found this morning lying in a hole on WARLEY Gap near Brentwood in Essex. There was a shocking wound in the face and some of the teeth were knocked in. The circumstances point to the girl having been murdered. The injuries were apparently caused by a blunt instrument, and the police are making inquiries into the matter. Later. The body has since been identified as that of Maud Garrett, aged about 18, of Alfred Road, Brentwood. She acted as housekeeper to her father, who is a bricklayer, and she left home soon after 8 o'clock last night to visit her sweetheart, a soldier who is a patient in the WARLEY Garrison Hospital. The spot where the body was found is a short distance beyond the WARLEY barracks. Deceased father identified the body by the clothing, his daughter's face being too terribly mutilated for him to recognise it. The identity was quickly established. Owing to the activity of Police Sergeant Martin Wedlock of Brentwood, the police have arrested a soldier stationed at WARLEY Barracks in connection with the affair. Maud has sustained absolutely horrific injuries, some of which are publicly announced. Others are referred to obtusely due to their shocking nature. The police and the military police are keen to get the murder resolved as quickly as possible and bring in Essex's most famous detective of the time, Detective Inspector Marden. As the neighbourhood is canvassed, reports come in that Maud has been seen with a soldier prior to her death. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 24th of May, 1903, a soldier charged with killing a girl. Early yesterday, the dead body of a young woman, 19 years of age, was found in WARLEY Gap, Brentwood, by a labourer named Cook, under circumstances which left no doubt that a brutal murder had been committed. The scene of the tragedy lies in the midst of richly wooded and furze-grown surroundings and is within a short walk of WARLEY Barracks. Shortly before 5 o'clock yesterday morning, Cook was on his way to his work as an assistant to a Brentwood contractor, noticed splashes of blood in the gap, and following marks came upon the body of the young woman, who was identified as Maud Garrett, the daughter of a bricklayer in WARLEY. The girl's face was battered almost beyond recognition, but her clothing enabled her father to identify her. The body was conveyed under the direction of Police Constable Thorogood of WARLEY to a stable in the rear of the Horse Artillery Tavern, which abuts on the WARLEY Road. Inquiries were at once set on foot by Police Superintendent Allen of Brentwood and Detective Inspector Marden of Moat Farm fame, with the result that half a dozen privates of the regiment stationed at WARLEY Barracks were ordered to be detained in the guardroom. It appears that the young woman left her house between 8 and 9 o'clock on Friday night to visit WARLEY Barracks for the purpose of seeing one of the men of the regiment to whom she was supposed to be engaged. So far could be ascertained, she did not visit him, but no definite trace of her movements could be ascertained from the time she left on her return journey home to the time she was found. WARLEY Gap, where the body was found, is a little frequented and lonely spot, and a spot where a crime could well be committed without detection. The father of the victim told our representative that he knew of no attachment which could account for the tragic death of the girl who acted as his housekeeper in his home in Alfred Street, Brentwood. Her father, who was naturally overwhelmed with grief, has been a widower for 10 years. Maud, who was a fine, tall girl of prepossessing appearance, was the youngest of his 4 daughters. Last evening, a post-mortem examination of the remains were made by Dr. Quennell. The inquest takes place on Monday. The inquest takes place giving further details of the evidence recovered, the timelines, and more details of the brutality of the horrors that she received. From the Essex Times, the 27th of May, 1903, the prisoner before the magistrates. On Monday at the courthouse in Brentwood, before the Honourable Fred Petrie, the inquest on the body of the deceased woman was opened at the Horse Artillery Public House, WARLEY Road, on Monday afternoon by Mr. C. E. Lewin, coroner for the district. The prisoner was accommodated with a chair between 2 police officers. Daniel Garrett of Alfred Road, Brentwood, was called, and he deposed that the deceased was his daughter, Maud Garrett, a single woman aged 20, and she lived with him and acted as his housekeeper. He last saw her alive at 10 minutes to 8 on Friday evening, when she was at home and wearing a straw hat. She had been out shopping and arrived back at about 20 to 8. While he was out in the yard, she went out again. He did not feel any concern about her non-return home, as she often slept with her sister as a companion when the husband was on night duty at the gasworks, and that was where he thought that she was. At about 4:15 on the Saturday morning, another daughter told him Maud had not come home, and in reply he said it was all right, as she had probably gone down to her sister's. At 20 minutes past 10 the same morning, he was fetched away from the works by the police to identify the body. The inquest was adjourned until Thursday week, June the 4th at 10 a.m. at the parochial hall. Captain Jeffreys held a short conversation with the prisoner, who seemed to realise his position more, having lost some of the indifference with which he appeared at the police court in the morning. He was subsequently taken down to Chelmsford by the 6:30 p.m. train. A crowd of people had gathered in the vicinity of the Horse Artillery public house in order to get a glimpse of the prisoner, who was conveyed to and from the house in a cab. Further details. What was used to inflict the wounds? It is stated that the accused used to walk out with the deceased, but was supplanted in her affections by a man of the Royal American Medical Corps, who is ill in the hospital at WARLEY. The deceased, Maud Garrett, is believed to have tried to see her sweetheart on Friday, and on her return to have met the prisoner, who was, it is said, being observed walking with her. The prisoner, who maintains a cheery mood and whistles in his cell, accounted for blood on his trousers and belt by saying that he cut his finger. He has a cut upon one finger, and when he returned to the barracks on Friday night, the prisoner is stated to have said to some comrades that a girl had done him a stinker, a phrase among the soldiers signifying that a girl who had promised a meeting had not turned up. It is rumoured that the prisoner left the barracks early on Saturday morning, and when he returned, news of the murder having then got about, he was detained in the guardroom with some others who were believed to have been out with girls. The deceased has always been regarded as a respectable girl by all who knew her. The injuries discovered upon the deceased, in addition to the horrible disfigurement of the face, are of a terrible character. Dr. Pepper, the Home Office expert, held a post-mortem examination on Saturday, and it is believed he found that a stick or other object of that kind had been forced right up the middle of the poor girl's body, piercing the bladder. The prison clothes had been sent to the Treasury for Dr. Pepper's further examination, together with a broken military cane. The Treasury, it is understood, will now take the case in hand. The case, as would be expected, attracts national headlines, with crowds of people attempting to attend the inquest with its gory details. Throughout, Private White seems removed from the events happening around him. From the Illustrated Police News, the 13th of June 1903, a Warley Gap murder, a terrible story of outrage, girl's body horribly mutilated. A large crowd had gathered in the vicinity of Brentwood Police Court on Saturday when Bernard White, private of the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment, was brought up for the third time on the charge of murdering Maud Garrett, aged 20, at Warley Gap on the night of May the 22nd. There was, however, no demonstration. The prisoner was dressed in khaki. Mr. Sims, in opening the case for the prosecution, said the prisoner joined the army in October 1900 and was drafted to Warley Barracks, where he made the acquaintance of the girl and believed that they were engaged. In 1901, the prisoner went out to the war in South Africa, and during his absence, the girl became engaged to a private in the Army Medical Corps named Jones. In May 1903, the prisoner returned from South Africa and was again stationed at Warley. In conversation with a man after his return, the accused mentioned that he was engaged to a young woman in the town and that she had promised to marry him when he got his stripes. Obviously, the prisoner was not aware that the deceased had thrown him over and become engaged to Private Jones. On May the 21st, the prisoner and the girl met, and an appointment was made for the next evening. On the 22nd, they met at about 9:45 in the evening. Two companions of the prisoner overtook them and urged White to hurry up, or he would be late for roll call. The prisoner was seen to leave the girl on the common, close to the common gate, while he went to the guardroom to report himself and then went on into his tent, which he reached at about 9:05. In the ordinary course, the accused should have remained in his tent for the rest of the night. Having got into the tent, however, he asked one of his companions to put down his bed, and he then slipped out again. The girl had been left at the common gate, and there was doubt from the fact and from a statement the accused afterwards made that he had slipped out of the tent for the purpose of keeping an appointment with her. At 10:15, when the bugle sounded lights out, the prisoner had not returned to his tent. At 11:15, he was still absent, but about 11 o'clock, just as the sentries were being changed, he came hurriedly into the tent, falling over the feet of his comrades as he did so. One of them remarked to him, "Did you see her?" meaning the girl, and the prisoner answered, "No, I didn't see her. I thought I saw her go away around the church," he added, "with a soldier with 2 stripes. He further stated that he had been searching for the girl and had been unable to find her. The prisoner then went to bed. Prosecutor Sims can say that the court would hear from a sentry and from a game watcher in an adjoining plantation that somewhere between 10:10 and 10:45 p.m. they heard the screams of a woman coming from the direction of WARLEY Gap, where the dead body of the girl was afterwards found. The next morning it was noticed by the prisoner's comrades that he was the first up in the tent, for when they awoke they found him shaking his bedding. The news of the murder soon afterwards came to the camp, and the prisoner discussed it with his comrades and also visited the scene of it. Subsequently, the prisoner was questioned by the police, and to Detective Inspector Marden he made a statement concerning his relations with the girl and their movements on the night in question. Speaking of the discovery of blood-stained trousers and belt with blood stains on it in the prisoner's kit, Mr. Sims said it was impossible that a small wound on the finger could produce the numerous bloodstains found on his trousers. Dr. Pepper would give evidence that these bloodstains were recent and were such as would cause a man treading in a pool of blood and splashing his trousers. A pair of boots belonging to the prisoner had been submitted for examination and had been found to be considerably stained with blood. The body of the girl bore altogether no fewer than 25 wounds. There were a number of lacerated wounds on the left side of the face, and all about the face there were numerous marks, crossing and recrossing each other, such as would be produced by a number of blows with a cane. In addition to these superficial wounds, there were others of so brutal a character that it seemed hardly possible they could have been inflicted by someone in his senses. It might be mentioned that some 2 or 3 years ago the prisoner, when at Norwich, suffered with epileptic fits, and on one occasion attempted to stab a comrade in the Suffolk regiment with a bayonet. He was subsequently examined by medical men who pronounced him to be insane, and he was confined for some 8 or 9 months in the Suffolk County Asylum, being afterwards discharged as cured. Private James Boller, one of the prisoner's comrades, spoke to being in his company on the evening of May 22nd and his leaving the witness in order to meet Maud Garrett. Subsequently, the witness saw the prisoner and Maud Garrett near the barracks. The prisoner followed the witness into the barracks, leaving Maud Garrett by the gate. The prisoner came onto their tent and asking the witness to put down the beds. While he was doing so, he noticed that the prisoner had disappeared. The witness and the others lay down and the witness went to sleep. He was awakened later by White coming into the tent. The witness asked him if he had met the girl, and the prisoner replied, "No, she has served me a stinker." "I am glad it serves you right," was the witness's comment. Next morning, when the witness awoke, he found the prisoner already up. When later the murder was being discussed, the prisoner mentioned that he had been up to the place and had seen a pool of blood. George Edward Foster Fitzgerald, captain in the Bedford Regiment at present stationed at Warley Barracks, deposed that between 10 and 10:30 p.m. on Friday, May the 22nd, he was in his quarters of the barracks. Sometime between the times mentioned, he heard a woman scream from the direction of Warley Gap. It was one rather prolonged scream. Joseph Oliver, a gamekeeper, gave evidence that on the night in question, while doing his rounds at about 11:15, he heard screams in the direction of Warley Gap. At first, he regarded them as a screech of an owl, but afterwards came to the conclusion that they were human screams. Colour Sergeant Henry Roberts deposed that on the night in question he was with Colour Sergeant Humphreys out for a walk. They had some refreshments at the Greyhound and left at about 10:30, returning to the barracks by Warley Gap. They passed the wooden fence, which the witness had since recognised as being near the place where Maud Garrett's body was found. And as they approached the place, they heard a groaning sound. They stopped to listen, but it was a very dark night, and they could not see anything, and the hearing was adjourned. It is upsetting and considered highly shocking to think that the murderer, in hearing people approach, stopped his horrific attacks, allowed people to pass, and then continued on with the brutal beating. The jury from the inquest find Private Bernard White guilty, and he is remanded for trial. From the Illustrated Police News, 27th of June 1903, the Warley Gap murder. The accused soldier committed for trial. A private in the 2nd Essex Regiment, stationed at Warley, named Bernard White, 22, was Friday charged on remand at Brentwood Police Court with the wilful murder at Warley Gap of Maud Garrett, 20, the daughter of a bricklayer of Alfred Street, Brentwood, on May the 23rd last. George Reed, private in the Royal Army Medical Corps stationed at Warley, said on Friday evenings, May 22nd last, he remembered meeting the deceased and the prisoner in Chase Road. He spoke to the girl, who said, "I went to the hospital last night to see Jones, but could not do so, and I shall not come any more, pass or no pass." She also said, "Tell Jones you've seen me." Detective Sergeant David Scott, stationed at Chelmsford, said that on May the 23rd last, he was engaged with Detective Inspector Marden and other officers in making inquiries into the case. The prisoner's kit was pointed out by Corporal Rochester. He examined the clothing, etc., and found recent blood stains. And he examined the prisoner's fingers, but found no sign of a recent cut. All the articles were handed over to Professor Pepper by witness for examination. Detective Inspector Alfred Marden stated that he reached Warley at 10 o'clock that morning after the murder and examined the spot very carefully for footmarks, but found none. He told the prisoner he was making inquiries about a girl who had been found murdered in Warley Gap that morning, and that the prisoner had told his sergeant major that he knew her. The prisoner said, "I'll tell you the same as I have told the sergeant." He then made a statement which the witness wrote down and read over to him, and which the prisoner signed. Sergeant Martin Wedlock, stationed at Brentford, who assisted in making inquiries, gave evidence of receiving a soldier's belt from Sergeant Humphrey. After Mr. Quennell had examined the body of the deceased, he took possession of her clothing, none of which were torn, before being removed from the body. On Sunday morning, he was searching in Warley Gap, and under a bush he found a black cane produced, and it appears to have blue mould on it. Alfred Straight, a labourer of 8 St. James's Place, Brentwood, stated that on June the 3rd he was walking by Warley Gap when he found the handkerchief produced stuck in a bush, which was about 100 yards away from the spot where the body was discovered. The handkerchief was stained when he found it. He examined it, and finding no name on it, placed it back again. On the following evening he went to the spot again, and with 2 companions, and they saw the handkerchief still there. One of the latter, named Philnott, took the handkerchief and afterwards gave it to Miss Webb at the county asylum. This concluded the evidence for the prosecution, and Mr. Langdon said he'd reserve his defence. The prisoner was then committed for trial. Asked if he had anything to say, the prisoner replied, "All I wish to say is that I am innocent." The trial. The trial that takes place brings forward the collective evidence from the inquest, the timeline of White's movements as attested to by several fellow soldiers, the screams heard giving a fairly precise time of death, the blood spots found on belt and buckle, the blood splatter found on the bottom of his trousers and upon his shoes, the bloody handkerchief recovered, the soldier's cane discovered, and with Private White's previous history and with a love triangle motive clearly established, Private Bernard White is found overwhelmingly guilty by the jury. From the Illustrated Police News, 21st of November 1903, condemned to die. Callous behaviour of the Warley Gap murderer. The revolting story of the Warley Gap murder was told at Essex Assizes when, before Mr. Justice Lawrence, Bernard White, 21, a private in the 2nd Essex Regiment, was indicted for the wilful murder of Maud Garrett at Little Warley on May the 22nd. Prisoner, a muscular young fellow attired in khaki, pleaded not guilty in a clear, firm voice. Mr. Gill, for prosecution, said there was no doubt the deceased was murdered the night of May 22nd with extraordinary brutality. Prisoner was the man who was last seen in her company. Maud Garrett was the daughter of a bricklayer named Daniel Garrett of Brentwood. The mother was dead, and she kept house for her father. She was a respectable girl, and during the time that prisoner was stationed at Warley Barracks, she made his acquaintance and became on friendly, if not affectionate terms, with him. Towards the end of 1901, the prisoner went out to South Africa, and he did not seem to have spoken to the girl again until the evening of May the 21st this year, when he was again at Warley. In the meantime, in May 1902, Maud Garrett became acquainted with a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps named Cecil B. Jones. She was seeing him very frequently, and in the end they became engaged to be married. Before and during May this year, Jones was ill and in hospital at Warley. Deceased used to visit him there practically every day. She went out the night of May the 20th with her sister and saw Jones, and on the next night, according to the prosecution, she met White accidentally, and they arranged to meet the following night. The prisoner was in the town next evening looking for her, and, subsequently, starting with 2 companions to go to the barracks, where they had to report themselves before 10 o'clock. He met Maud Garrett near the railway bridge, stopped and joined her, and the other soldiers went on. What took place between the prisoner and the deceased, it was impossible to tell. But they were seen walking together as far as the gate of the barracks, and this was at a few minutes to 10 p.m. Prisoner left the deceased at the gate, went to his tent, and as the lights will be out at 10:15, there would be no further need for him to move, unless he took the opportunity of slipping out and rejoining the waiting girl. The case for the Crown was that he rejoined the girl and took her to a place where he murdered her. It was a lonely spot at WARLEY Gap, a distance of something like 700 yards away. The night was dark, and there were woods on the right and left-hand side. Between 10 and 10:30 p.m., the officer whose room at the barracks directly faced WARLEY Gap heard a prolonged scream, apparently that of a woman. Other persons also heard screams. Prisoner was next seen by his companions in the tent at 11 o'clock, having thus been away for about an hour. In re-entering, he stumbled over one of the men lying down. The man asked, "Did you see her?" And the prisoner replied, "No, she's done me a stinker. I thought I saw her going round by the church with a chap with 2 badges." On the following morning, prisoner was out of the tent by 4:45. The murdered woman was found with her head kicked so that the bones were broken, the eyeballs broken, the teeth broken, and she had apparently been struck across the face backwards and forwards with a cane. Someone did go that morning to the place the body was, because it was dragged apparently by the foot from the road a few yards into a hole in the ground. Who could have done that except the murderer? Robbery, said counsel, was obviously not the motive for this murder, for 5 shillings was found in the girl's pocket. Examination revealed that the murderer had wreaked his vengeance on the body in a diabolical manner, and the injuries were such as could be caused by a cane. Evidence was then called bearing out counsel's statement. Dr. Pepper of the Home Office said the deceased had 6 wounds, probably caused by a cane, on the left cheek. The jaw was broken, teeth knocked out, and the left eyeball fractured. Death was due to shock from these injuries. Witness said he found blood on the prisoner's trousers. Mr. Forrest Fulton, on behalf of the prisoner, said there were discrepancies in the evidence. The judge then summed up, and the jury found the prisoner guilty, and the death sentence was passed. White continues to protest his innocence up to his execution. There were many comments about his unseeming lack of care regarding his fate. Other than a slight wobble upon approaching the scaffolds, White faced his execution firmly. From the Illustrated Police News, the 5th of November 1903, the WARLEY Gap murder, soldier executed. At Chelmsford on Tuesday morning, Bernard White, 21, of the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment, was executed for the murder of Maud Garrett at WARLEY Gap in May. The young woman was found dead with wounds on the head and her jaw broken, and there were also other terrible injuries. White served in South Africa and became jealous of the girl on his return. At the trial, Mr. Justice Lawrence said the murder was one of the foulest and most cruel he'd ever heard. White, who passed a very good night, had an egg and bread and butter for breakfast, and was attended by the Reverend A.C. Shepherd, a Roman Catholic priest, who recited the litany during the walk to the scaffold. The condemned man said the responses, and just as he uttered, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit," the drop fell. Although White looked very pale, he walked firmly to the scaffold. Billington was the executioner and death was instantaneous. Case 2. The Moat Farm Murder Mystery, 1903. We begin this story with some background information on Miss Camille Holland and Samuel Dougal. Camille Holland was a self-reliant woman residing in Elgin Crescent in London. At the time that this saga begins, Camille was 56 years of age and a spinster, a very wealthy spinster. She had managed her financial affairs adeptly, overseeing a substantial portfolio valued at approximately £6,000, worth approximately £950,000 in 2023. Samuel Dougal. Dougal had something of a checkered past. Dougal was 4 years younger than Camille. Dougal's history included a distinguished military career, rising to the rank of Chief Clerk in the Royal Engineers, and from within his extensive military career, Dougal had had the opportunity to traverse the globe, including nearly a decade in Halifax, Nova Scotia. During his tenure in Nova Scotia, Dougal lost both his first and second wives in rapid succession. The initial loss occurred in 1885, when his first wife succumbed to a sudden illness. Dougal swiftly remarried, only to endure the death of his second wife a mere 3 months into their union. Departing from the army in 1887, Dougal's life took a tumultuous turn, marked by fleeting relationships with multiple women and a string of short-lived employment stints. In 1895, while stationed in Dublin at the office of the commander of the forces, he found himself entangled in a forgery conviction that resulted in a 12-month sentence of hard labour. 2 months into his incarceration, he attempted suicide, leading to the remainder of his sentence being served in a mental asylum. In all of his misadventures, questions arose as to whether all was as it seemed. The quick and untimely deaths of his 2 wives were questioned at the time, but there was no proof of any wrongdoing. Camille Holland and Samuel Dougal. During the autumn of 1898, Camille and Dougal's paths crossed, and a relationship was begun. In January 1899, released Dougal and wealthy spinster Camille embarked on a new chapter together, relocating to Saffron Walden to assume ownership of their new residence, Coldham's Farm near Clavering. Although not formally married, and with Camille continuing to maintain her independent business dealings, the couple presented themselves publicly as Mr. and Mrs. Dougal. The selection of the property was orchestrated by Samuel but funded by Camille, who, despite Samuel's objections, insisted on retaining the property in her own name. In April of 1899, Mr. and Mrs. Dougal established their residence at Coldham's Farm, which they subsequently rechristened MOAT Farm. The maid incident. Their new maid, Florence Havers, joined the household on May the 13th. However, Florence quickly found herself the target of Samuel's inappropriate advances, enduring unwanted attention in the kitchen on May the 14th and facing an attempted intrusion into her room on the night of the 16th. Resisting his advances, Florence managed to alert Camille, who promptly intervened. In response, Camille sent Samuel to bed, and she and Florence shared a room for the subsequent 3 nights. The end of Camille. On the night of May 19th, Florence Havers found herself alone in the house with Samuel Dougal. Earlier that evening at 6:30 p.m., Samuel and Camille had departed in a pony and trap. Samuel returned at 8:30 p.m. and informed Florence that Camille had gone to London and was expected to return later that night. Throughout the evening, Samuel was in and out of the house, finally returning at 12:45 a.m., advising Florence to go to bed. The next morning at 7 a.m., Florence was surprised to find Samuel already up, dressed, and eating breakfast. Samuel explained that he had received a letter from Camille stating that she had gone on holiday. Florence saw no letter. Unbeknownst to Samuel at the time, Florence had already arranged for her mother to collect her that morning, and she promptly left MOAT Farm after collecting her wages. The next 4 years, Samuel's solitude was short-lived, as he welcomed a new maid, Emma Burgess, and was joined by yet another Mrs. Dougal, who was actually his third wife. Over the next 4 years, Samuel maintained his residence at the farm, engaging in a succession of liaisons with women. He integrated into the local community, displaying regular attendance at church and contributing generously to local charities, including the expansion of the churchyard and the interior redecoration of the church. Samuel's extravagant generosity was welcomed, but questioned too. Where had the money come from? In March 1903, this question was answered. Samuel was charged with forging a cheque for £28.15, supposedly drawn by Camille C. Holland, dated the 28th of August 1902 and payable to J. Heath at Claverling. Samuel faced trial. The proceedings, commencing in the spring of 1903, revealed a systematic depletion of funds from Camille's accounts to his own. He had been in the process of liquidating her stocks and shares and transferring the Moat Farm title from her name to his. From the Mid-Sussex Times, the 31st of March 1903, Moat Farm Mystery. Forgery charge against Samuel Dougal. At Saffron Walden on March the 27th, Samuel Dougal was charged on remand with forging a cheque in the name of Miss Camille Holland. Counsel for the prosecution, in opening the case, said that the prisoner, who was a married man in 1898, made the acquaintance of Miss Holland, who possessed over £6,000 and lived with her in various places. Eventually, Miss Holland purchased the Moat Farm near Saffron Walden, and the two settled there in April 1899. The fraud charges brought up the question of where Miss Camille Holland was. It rapidly became apparent that Miss Holland had disappeared. In a few weeks, Miss Holland disappeared, and the prisoner had since continued to live at the farm, and by means of cheques professing to be signed by Miss Holland and through the use of other documents, had obtained the money belonging to that lady. Evidence for the prosecution. Mr. Ernest Legrand Holland, a civil servant employed at Somerset House, said he was the son of Miss Holland's only brother. The last time he saw his aunt was in 1893, and he knew nothing whatever of the prisoner or of his aunt's acquaintance with him. She was a good businesswoman and knew how to look after things. The signature to the cheque for £28 was not in his aunt's handwriting, nor was any other part of cheque. The witness identified the ring produced as his aunt's and said that he had also recognised the piano at Moat Farm and various articles of furniture of hers. Mrs. Whiskin, Market Road, Saffron Walden, said that the accused, Samuel Dougal, and a lady took rooms at her house in January 1899 as Mr. and Mrs. Dougal. He told her to take in letters which came addressed to Miss C.C. Holland. She recognised a photograph of Miss Holland, now produced, as that of the lady. The witness said that the couple were upon affectionate terms. Kate Cranwell stated that she was on December the 9th, 1901, engaged as a housemaid as a girl named Hannah Cole was going away. The witness was there about 9 months. There was a trunk there which contained 15 ladies' dresses, some of them silk shawls, and almost everything a lady would require. Being shown a photograph of Miss Holland, she said she had never seen that lady there. At this stage, the prisoner was remanded, and the bench refused to allow bail. Dougal is held as police continue to investigate. What unfolds is the systematic depletion of Camille's considerable portfolio, and that the fraud went far beyond the initial cheque fraud that had started the investigation. The question of where Miss Holland could be and what had happened to her now became critical. The history of Moat Farm is looked into, previous tenants are traced, and a timeline is created as to Dougal's actions and when Miss Holland was last seen. From the Hants and Sussex News, the 22nd of April 1903, another remand. Samuel Herbert Dougal was again charged at Saffron Walden on the 10th inst. With forging the name of Miss Camille C. Holland, with whom he formerly lived at the Moat Farm, Cleverling. The court was again crowded. A servant's evidence. Mrs. Blackwell, whose maiden name was Havers, was a former servant to Dougal, and who went to Moat Farm in May 1899, said she first knew Miss Holland as Mrs. Dougal. Mrs. Blackwell explained that Dougal had kissed her and tried to get into her room, after which she described Miss Holland's final departure from the farm. This took place on May the 19th, 1899, when Miss Holland and Dougal drove away together in a pony and trap at about 8:30 p.m. The witness did not see her again. She explained that Dougal returned about 8:30 in the evening, saying that Miss Holland had gone to London, but was returning that night. He told her to go to bed, but she remained up in her room. He went to meet all the London trains that night. Dougal was in and out all night. She did not know what became of the pony. The next morning Dougal told her that he had a letter from Miss Holland saying she had gone for a little holiday. Witness left Moat Farm that day. According to other evidence, Miss Holland, when staying at a Bayswater boarding house in 1898, was visited by Dougal, and it was understood that she was going to marry him. A fortnight after the lady disappeared from Moat Farm, Dougal's wife and child arrived. Dougal was, at this stage, further remanded. On March the 19th, 1903, the police effectively commandeered Moat Farm to scrutinise potential clues relating to Camille's disappearance. During the investigation, Moat Farm became a focal point not only for law enforcement but also for the public. Camille's mysterious vanishing seized the collective imagination, attracting reporters from both local and national newspapers, along with curious onlookers. From the Scotsman, the 29th of April 1903, the Moat Farm Mystery. Police Sergeant Scott said that he had temporarily resided in the Moat House since March 19th. He had since been engaged in searching for the remains of Miss Holland. On the 27th of April, he was carrying on digging operations in a ditch that had been filled in. His attention was drawn to a spot in the ditch where he saw a small boot, a left foot, and what appeared to be a piece of woman's dress. With the assistance of other officers, he carefully removed the soil and afterwards found the remains now shown to the jury. The body was enveloped in a dress of black material. It was lying on the right side, 4 feet from the surface of the ground. There were some thorn bushes on top of the body, and on the skull he found several hairpins which he preserved. He had the body photographed and with assistance removed it to the conservatory. He was present at the post-mortem examination. The trench where the body was found appeared to have been filled in 3 or 4 years ago. It had formerly been used to drain sewage into the small moat. The left foot had evidently been detached by the digging operation. The body discovered has been identified by several persons as that of Miss Holland. From early morning until dusk today, Moat House Farm was a centre of great attraction to the Essex villagers for miles around. Hundreds of persons of all classes visited the scene of the mystery. The road leading from Newport railway station to Clavering was crowded with pedestrians, cyclists and sightseers in traps and wagonettes and other conveyances. Many of these visitors rumbled over the farmstead and took snapshots of the house and farm buildings and also of the ditch where the body was found. They exhibited a morbid interest regarding the canvas screen marking the spot where the body was found, and still hidden from public gaze until the Home Office analyst and coroner's jury had examined the excavation. Several constables were on duty preventing intruders from trampling down the banks of the ditch and encroaching on those parts of the farm still kept private. Throughout the day, the police were engaged in the task of establishing the identity of the deceased woman. Local excitement was intensified when it became known that Mrs. Wiskin, with whom Miss Holland and Dougal lodged at South Saffron Walden, had recognised the remains. Mrs. Wiskin drove from Saffron Walden early this morning and, accompanied by Superintendent Daniels and Sergeant Hollett of Essex Constabulary, she was taken to the greenhouse, the improvised mortuary, where she declared her belief that the body was that of Miss Holland. It was impossible for the witness to identify the remains from Miss Holland's physiognomy, the flesh having withered away. Mrs. Wiskin is of the opinion that the dress is that worn by Miss Holland when she last saw her. Mrs. Wiskin says she is confirmed in her opinion by the fact that the shoes found on the corpse were precisely similar in size and shape to those Miss Holland usually wore. The silk ribbon found tied around the neck of the corpse was peculiar to the missing lady. The appearance soon after 5 o'clock of a trap conveying 2 detective officers and 2 women gave rise to much speculation. This was set at rest when it became known that the visitors were Mrs. Blackwell and her mother. The former Miss Havers, now Mrs. Blackwell, was in service at Moat House Farm at the time of Miss Holland's disappearance, and she is believed to be the last person at Clavering who actually saw Miss Holland alive. Miss Blackwell's sad task resulted in a distressing scene. On entering the house, she gave the child she was carrying into the care of her mother. Accompanied by a detective, she proceeded to the hothouse, where she was confronted with the remains. Without hesitation, she declared the corpse to be that of her late mistress. She was convinced the clothes were those of Miss Holland. Shortly afterwards, she was overcome and became unconscious. Restoratives were applied, and after a long interval she revived. The police were about to drive her to the station when she again lost consciousness and remained in that state for 2 hours. At 8:30, the two women, accompanied by 3 police officials, drove in Dougal's farm cart to the station. On the way to Waltham Cross, Mrs. Blackwell was still hysterical and had to be assisted into the carriage. Mrs. Blackwell's definite identification of the body is considered of the greatest importance. It is now believed that all doubt as to the identity of the corpse is set at rest. The inquest will be held on Thursday. Another correspondent states that when Mrs. Whiskin scanned the dress, she was not long in pronouncing that she could swear to the skirt being worn by Miss Holland, as there was a patch upon it which she had placed there herself. It had been noticed as a curious coincidence that the discovery of the body was made exactly 4 years after the very day on which Miss Holland entered into possession of Moat Farm. With what would seem to be confirmed identification of Camille Holland, the next question is to understand how she died. Several days later, the body underwent examination by Professor Pepper, a Home Office expert, along with Doctors Storrs and Sprague, divisional police surgeons. Their findings reveal that Camille had suffered a close-range gunshot wound to the head. Professor Pepper concluded that the bullet must have caused immediate insensibility, which would have continued until death. An inquest is held, and the jury finds Dougal guilty of murder. Dougal will go on trial. From the Hants and Sussex News, the 13th of May, 1903. The Moat Farm Mystery. Dougal charged with murder. Samuel Herbert Dougal appeared before the Essex County Magistrates to answer the charge of murder. He did not go to Saffron Walden by the usual route on account of the hostile demonstrations made against him the last time he was brought here from Cambridge Jail. Before further evidence was called, the clerk of the court read the charge. The prisoner, who stood in the dock, leaned slightly forward to catch the words. Samuel Herbert Dougal, read the clerk, you are further charged that, on the 19th of May at Clavering, in the county of Essex, you did feloniously and wilfully, and of your malice and aforethought, kill and murder Camille C. Holland. Dougal had a word with his solicitor and then said in a clear, resonant voice, Not guilty, your worship. Sergeant Scott, who acted as chief of the gang of diggers instructed to search in the grounds of Moat Farm for the body of Miss Holland, again described the finding of Miss Holland's body in the ditch running between the horse pond and the small moat. Witness, continuing his evidence, said, He had found in the house a box of 34 loaded revolver cartridges. Mrs. Wiskin then entered the box. The evidence she gave at an earlier hearing was read over to her. She now repeated the testimony she gave to the coroner, describing how she identified the clothing found on Miss Holland's body. Dr. Pepper of St. Mary's Hospital, London, said that on April the 29th he made a post-mortem examination of the body lying at the Moat farm. The body, when he saw it, was lying on the right side with the left leg drawn up and the right leg slightly bent, the head inclined towards the chest. The length of the body was 5 foot 1 inches. The remains were very much decomposed and must have been in contact with wet soil for a very long time. There was no fracture of the bones and limbs. On the right side of the skull, above and behind the ear, was a round aperture. The margin of the aperture was sharply defined and was 1/4 inch in diameter. On the left side of the head there was a more or less circular aperture, the centre of which was 1.5 inches behind the external angular process of the frontal bone and 1.5 inches above the bone across the cheek. The bullet was found in the skull immediately below the aperture on the left side. It was elongated in length and weighed about 83 grains. The brain was remarkably well preserved considering the generally advanced state of decomposition of the body. The bullet wound on the brain must have caused immediate insensibility, which would continue till death. From the amount of injury done, the shot must have been fired at a comparatively short distance. He could not say what distance because of the absence through decomposition of scorching, singeing of the hair, or blackening by powder. It could not possibly have been self-inflicted. The shot, he continued, must have been fired from behind. The part of the bullet which had not struck the bone was the same size as the corresponding portion of the bullet taken from the box found by Sergeant Scott. Other witnesses testified as to Miss Holland's transactions with her bank, the frequent drawing of cheques bearing what purported to be her signature after her disappearance in May 1899, Dougal's transactions with the Birkbeck Bank, and other matters. The defence focused on 2 key points: that it could not be completely guaranteed that the body found was indeed Miss Holland, and that any case against Dougal was purely circumstantial. Dougal himself claimed that he had never attempted to enter the maid's room. The noise that had been heard was one of the weights of the clock striking against the wall. He stated that he had never received any letters addressed to Camille Holland. On the day in question, as outlined by the maid, he stated that he and Miss Holland had had a tiff regarding the claims of the servant. He stated that he had driven Miss Holland to Stansted railway station with luggage that consisted of 2 boxes. He had not heard from her since, and had not known when she went. From the Essex Times, the 24th of June 1903, The Moat Farm Mystery, the Trial of Dougal. The case of the criminal calendar of the Essex Summer Assizes was that in which Samuel Herbert Dougal, the ex-army pensioner who, on Monday, was indicted for the wilful murder of Miss Camille Cecil Holland, a well-connected lady of about 56 years of age, who lived with Dougal at the lonely Moat Farm in Clavering, and who disappeared on the night of May the 18th, 1899. There were numerous other indictments against Dougal for forging Miss Holland's names on 2 checks. The case for the Crown was that the deceased woman was, in May 1899, living at Clavering, and her body was found on the 27th of April in the present year 1903 at Moat Farm, where she had lived with the prisoner. She had been shot through the head, and the body was buried in the ditch where it was found close to the Moat farmhouse. The deceased woman was in 1899 about 56 years of age. Miss Holland was a lady of property to the extent of between £6,000 and £7,000. The earliest date of her acquaintance with Dougal appeared to be December 1898, and afterwards they were living near Brighton and at Saffron Walden, where they had a bedroom and sitting room with Mrs. Whiskin as man and wife. From here they removed to Moat Farm, formerly Coldham Farm, in Clavering. On the 9th of May, a girl named Florence Havers, now Mrs. Blackwell, was engaged as general servant. The only occupants of the house were the prisoner and Miss Holland, living as man and wife, and this servant girl. The prisoner was said to have attempted to kiss the servant, who made a complaint to Miss Holland. On the night of the 16th of May, the servant girl had gone upstairs to bed, and at about 9 o'clock, and Miss Holland had gone upstairs at about the same time to her room. The prisoner went to the servant girl's door and whispered her name, and attempted with considerable force to wrench the door open. The girl screamed, with the result that Miss Holland came up on the scene. The girl fainted. She was restored, and Miss Holland being with her, the prisoner went to his room to bed. Conversations took place between the servant and Miss Holland, and they slept together 2 or 3 nights. This was the state of things on Friday, the 19th of May. Miss Holland, living at Moat Farm, bought by her money, furnished with the furniture which belonged to her, her dog there, her jewellery and pictures there, and other articles which she valued not altogether from their intrinsic value, but sentimentally because of their family association. Miss Holland had evidently gone there with the intention of staying, but such a condition of things existed about the 19th of May, which might have aroused the prisoner's doubt as to what might occur in the event of Miss Holland taking any step in consequence of his conduct. No human eye had ever seen Miss Holland since May the 19th, 1899. Her affairs were carried on during the years that intervened between that time and the prisoner's arrest on the charge of forgery, the prisoner being subsequently charged with wilfully murdering her. The jury retired to consider their verdict at a few minutes to 4 o'clock, and after an absence of an hour returned into court. During their absence, the crowded court sat quietly, but almost impatiently. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. Asked if he had any reason why the sentence of death should not be passed upon him, Dougal made no reply, and having assumed the black cap, the judge passed a sentence of death. The guilty sentence held, despite attempts for a reprieve. Samuel Herbert Dougal was executed at Chelmsford Prison on the 14th of July, 1903, by William Billington. Case 3. The mother-in-law murder in Armagh, Ireland. Armagh in Ireland in 1905. Isaac Pearson had been accused of rape. as he sits in his cell contemplating his assured doom. He speaks of a dream that he had had of his wife and sister killing his mother. His mother had passed several months before, and his wife had run off to Canada. Officials are skeptical, but in due diligence they exhume his mother's body and are astounded by the volume of metallic mercury and strychnine found within her system. Isaac's wife had emigrated to Canada and his sister had moved to England. The family members. Alice Pearson, aged 74, is the matriarch of the family with savings of an equivalent value of £15,000 in 2024. Isaac Pearson, her son, Sarah Ann Pearson, her son's wife and her daughter-in-law, and Agnes Aggie Black, her married daughter. About Alice Pearson. Alice Pearson, in her retirement, had her son, daughter and their respective spouses move in with her. Unfortunately, family tensions arose, leading to conflicts between Alice and her children, Isaac and Agnes, and with her daughter-in-law, Sarah Ann. Despite having some savings, Alice's children swiftly depleted Alice's money. In a questionable move, her daughter Agnes took out life insurance on her mother for the substantial amount of £8, 14 shillings, worth a little over £1,000 in 2024, with Agnes set to receive this sum in the event of Alice's demise. In June 1904, Alice, at the age of 74, suddenly dies from extreme convulsions after having eaten a hearty meal that had been prepared for her by Sarah Ann, wife of her son Isaac Pearson. Alice dies painfully. All of the neighbours comment on the strange suddenness of her death, but no further action is taken, mostly due to her advanced age. With her burial and no questions asked from the authorities, everything quietens down. Sarah Ann leaves Isaac and emigrates to Canada. Agnes Black, Alice's daughter, moves to England. And on the 7th of December 1904, Pearson, Alice's son, is indicted for violating a girl. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News on the 7th of December 1904, Portadown case. Isaac Pearson was indicted for committing an offence against a girl named Mary McAladian near Portadown on the 28th July last. The jury found the prisoner guilty of an attempted offence and assault. Sitting in his cell whilst awaiting his trial, Isaac considers his limited options. One news report wrote that Isaac approached the magistrates stating that he had had a dream that his mother had been killed by his wife and sister. Other news reports state that the dream sequence was nonsense and that he had directly approached the governor offering information about the murder of his mother some 6 months prior. Isaac's information is treated with skepticism by the authorities, possibly motivated by an attempt to limit the harshness of his sentencing coupled with revenge at his wife for leaving him. However, in a due diligence kind of way, the body of Isaac's mother is exhumed for testing. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News, the 15th of November 1904, analysts report not yet made, an absurd rumour. It is not thought probable that an inquest will be held on the remains of Mrs. Pearson, whose body was exhumed a few days ago in consequence of a statement made by her son, at present in Armagh jail, awaiting trial on charge of criminal assault, to the effect that his mother died from the effects of poison administered, as he alleged, by his wife Alice Pearson, who is now in America. The authorities have not yet received the report of Professor Berkeley, to whom the viscera of the deceased woman was forwarded for analysis. The true version of the alleged murder cannot, therefore, be known until the police adduce the evidence which they have collected at the magisterial investigation, but before that can take place, it will be necessary for the constabulary to get into their custody one or perhaps two persons who would appear to be implicated and who are not at present within the jurisdiction. There is absolutely no truth in the absurd statement circulated in an evening newspaper that the prisoner, Isaac Pearson, had given the secret away in a dream. The fact is that he intimated to prison officials that he desired to make a confession and asked to see a magistrate. District Inspector Cottingham from Portadown, who has charge of the case and who, with Head Constable Devin, has been vigorously prosecuting inquiries for time, was appraised of this and afterwards attended at the jail and took the man's statement. Pearson has a sister who is supposed to be living in England. However, to everyone's surprise, with analysis done on Alice's exhumed body, large quantities of both metallic mercury and strychnine are found. The metallic mercury would not have killed Alice, but it would have given her stomach and bowel issues. The strychnine, on the other hand, could easily have killed several people. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News on the 19th of November 1904, the Portadown poisoning case, result of the analysis. Unless a special order is given by the Irish government, it is not intended to hold an inquest on the remains of Mrs. Pearson, whose body was exhumed some days ago in consequence of an allegation that she had died from the effects of poison administered by her daughter-in-law. This serious charge was preferred by the deceased's son, Isaac, against his wife, Sarah Ann Pearson, who is at present in Canada. As already reported, Isaac Pearson is confined in the county jail awaiting trial on the charge of criminal assault. That the late Mrs. Pearson died from the effects of an irritant poison there is now not the shadow of doubt, for Mr. Robert Berkeley of Belfast, who analysed the stomach, found it very considerably full of metallic mercury together with traces of strychnine. The truth or falsity of the prisoner's allegation that the poison was administered by his wife is, of course, a matter that has to be proven. It is expected that it will be some considerable time before the police will be in possession and position to place the evidence which they have collected before the magistrates. It will be first necessary for them to get into their custody one or two persons, but before that can be accomplished, certain rules and regulations will have to be complied with. In the meantime, it is expected that the authorities will here have made arrangements for having the suspected persons kept under investigation and observation. With a murder investigation underway and two suspects in different international locations, efforts are made to find both Sarah Ann, the daughter-in-law, and Aggie, the daughter. Police investigators are sent to Canada and England to attempt to capture the two suspects and bring them back to Armagh for trial. Sarah Ann, with collected evidence weighing most heavily against her, is brought to trial first, with the daughter, Agnes Black, attending the whole of the proceedings. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News, the 20th February 1905. The Rich Hill poisoning case, magisterial investigation, serious charges against relatives, sensational evidence. The proceedings in connection with the Rich Hill poisoning mystery were opened at Armagh on Saturday, when two women, daughter-in-law and daughter, accused of the alleged murder of old Mrs. Pearson at Mullalleesh on June the 27th last, were brought up at the courthouse and charged with the crime. The story of the murder was told to the prison officials while Isaac Pearson, son of the deceased, was in Armagh jail awaiting trial for assaulting upon a woman, for which at the Winter Assizes in Belfast he was sentenced to 15 months' imprisonment. Agnes Black, daughter of the deceased, was arrested at Wallsend Police Office on the 15th of December. On the journey across to Ireland, she is alleged to have made important statements to the officer in whose custody she was, which led to further inquiries from which serious developments are expected. Mrs. Black, who, during her imprisonment under remand in Armagh jail, has given birth to a child, denies any complicity in the crime and declares that she was hurried away from her mother's house on the day that she met her sudden death. Mrs. Alice Pearson, deceased, complained that day that her dinner was bitter and died shortly after the meal, but owing to her advanced age, death was attributed to natural causes. There was some talk amongst the neighbours afterwards, and suspicions of an unnatural death were freely spoken of, but until the confession of Pearson in prison, there was no direct evidence upon which the police could base any charge. When the body was exhumed and the viscera was analysed by Professor Berkeley of Belfast, a considerable quantity of metallic mercury and strychnine were discovered, the purpose of which has since been investigated by the police with successful result. Isaac Pearson, who is still in jail undergoing the sentence imposed upon him by Judge Wright, will not be called as a witness in view of the fact that his wife and sister are incriminated. It appears that on the voyage from Canada to Derry, Mrs. Pearson made statements to Sergeant Richardson, the officer who received her into custody under the extradition warrant. But the nature of this has not yet been disclosed. It is believed, however, to have an important bearing on the case. The two prisoners were separately conveyed from Armagh jail to the courthouse in Abroham. Mrs. Black arrived first, followed shortly afterwards by her sister-in-law, Mrs. Pearson. A large crowd had assembled in the vicinity of the Hall of Justice to witness the arrival of the accused. The first incident of interest at the sitting of the court was the identification by a druggist of one of the accused, who purchased poison from him. After a careful survey in the court, he pointed to Mrs. Pearson, who was attired in black and sat in the barrister's bench, accompanied by a number of other women, including Agnes Black, all wearing dark costumes. Mr. Belford, the clerk of the court, having read the charge, the evidence was ready by Mr. Monroe for the Crown. Mrs. Pearson was evidently labouring under a great agitation, and followed the course of the case with the keenest interest. A pathetic figure was the other prisoner, Mrs. Black, who fondled her newly born babe in her arms. Several witnesses are brought forward attesting to Alice Pearson's general robust health at the time of her unexpected death, despite her advanced years. Also of the known fractious relationship within the family and the easy spending ways of both children. Testimony is given regarding an increase in diarrhea that Alice had commented upon to her friends. This would be the expected result from poisoning by metallic mercury, which probably would not kill you, but would certainly impact the body. There was a considerable amount of metallic mercury in Alice's body, giving the impression that attempts had been made to poison her slowly. More witnesses are produced who had been by Alice when she died and had seen the convulsive torment she underwent before her death, shortly after the heavy meal she had received from Sarah Ann Pearson, her daughter-in-law. Further evidence is brought forward of Agnes having taken out an insurance policy on her mother prior to her mother's death. The small sum Aggie referred to is approximately £8, which is worth a little over £1,000 in 2024. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News, 22nd of February 1905, The Doctor's Evidence, Rich Hill Poisoning Case. The magisterial investigation into the Rich Hill poisoning mystery was further continued yesterday in the courthouse in Armagh, when Mrs. Agnes Black and Mrs. Sarah Ann Pearson, daughter and daughter-in-law respectively of the late Alice Pearson of Mullaveley near Kirkhill, were charged with having wilfully and feloniously caused Alice Pearson's death on the 27th of June last, administering poison to her. As on the 2 previous days of the inquiry, the prisoners were driven to the courthouse in charge of police escort. Mrs. Black carried her infant charge in her arms and nursed it tenderly and with evident affection throughout the day. Both prisoners looked much more depressed than on Monday and were, as usual, accommodated with seats behind their respective solicitors. They never once recognized each other during the proceedings and studiously avoided even passing a glance in the same direction. Main interest centred on the evidence of Sergeant Richardson and Professor Barclay. Sergeant Richardson had brought the prisoner Sarah Ann Pearson from Montreal, and it was an accepted belief that to him she had made an important statement after the arrest. Though it was a market day in Armagh, there was again a large attendance of the general public. Professor Barclay, public analyst from Belfast and the counties of Antrim, Tyrone, Donegal and Londonderry, an analyst to a number of public bodies, was the next witness. Examined by the Crown Solicitor, he deposed that on November the 8th of last year he received from Sergeant McReynolds, Rich Hill, a box containing 4 jars and a bottle, all properly sealed. The first jar labelled name of deceased Alice Pearson, part of body enclosed, stomach. Date of examination 7th of November 1904. The contents of the stomach, said the witness, consisted principally potatoes, porridge and milk. He found metallic mercury which weighed 462 grams, equal to 2,694 grains, this being mixed with the food. The mercury separated out quite easily. It had never before been found, nor had he been able to trace any record of a similar case where the mercury was found or in such quantity in a human body. Witness produced a bottle containing the mercury. He also found in the stomach 1/7 of a grain of strychnine. The second jar contained the liver and kidneys of the deceased. In both of these organs he found strychnine to the extent of 132 grains. Of the metallic mercury found, the analyst said that mercury did not act as a poison, while in its metallic state, although it was popularly considered to be poison. He thought it must have been administered almost immediately before the strychnine, and that this accounted for it remaining in the body. When asked about the properties of strychnine, the doctor responded that its impact was on the nervous system, producing convulsions and contractions. Having regard to the fact that the deceased complained of a bitter taste in her mouth before dinner and again after it, and was then seized with these muscular contractions, it would help to draw a conclusion as to when it was taken or administered. In his opinion, the death of Alice Pearson had been caused by strychnine poisoning. With the establishment of strychnine having been purchased by Sarah Ann having made the last meal before Alice died, the insurance policy on her mother's life from Agnes, the case was looking bleak, albeit purely circumstantial. Sarah Ann, extradited from Canada, found an unexpected confidant in the Armagh policeman escorting her back. Unaware that he was meticulously documenting their conversations, she unwittingly provided a comprehensive and admissible confession. Police Sergeant's story, Mrs. Pearson's remarkable statements. Sergeant Richardson, who was called for examination before 3:30, replying to Mr. Munro, said the warrant for the arrest of Sarah Ann Pearson in Canada was handed to him. When he saw Sarah Ann Pearson on the 31st of January, she made a statement on that occasion, and she had not received any warning from himself. She said, Aggie and Isaac are a bad pair to get me into this trouble. I bought 3p worth of strychnine in Oars in Armagh. It was Isaac gave me the money and paid for my cab in. I gave it to her in her dinner of mashed potatoes and eggs. When she was eating, she said it was sour, and she said she didn't like it. I said it was the same as I took myself. When I bought the poison, I gave the name of Sarah Hewitt. I gave the name of my own hometown, Richhill. And when I went to live with Alice, Agnes had her almost purged to death. She continued, they laughed in court in Canada when they heard about him, Isaac, dreaming. It was a nice dream. His eyes were open when he dreamed it. He knew as much about it as I did. At a later period, while on the steamer returning to London, she said, I had to laugh at Agnes the night the old woman died. She looked at her insurance book and said, God damn, I'll only get half of the insurance money. That is what was troubling her at the time. She said later, I don't expect to get off free, and I don't deserve it. It was too wicked an act. It was all Isaac's fault, all for a few pounds. If it was a couple of thousands, it would be something, and I never got a halfpenny of it. They divided it all between them, and I threw the remainder of the strychnine into the fire. While the evidence was being heard, Mrs. Pearson's eyes darted rapidly and affrighted glances between the sergeant and the magistrates, as if to estimate its effect, and her complexion, pallid at the best of times, became almost ashen in its pallor as she listened to the narration of the dreadful admission she had made. The other prisoner, Agnes Black, sat and listened in open-mouthed astonishment to the evidence, clutching her little baby convulsively to her breast, her eyes starting wildly. So terrible was the impression made by the evidence that not a sound was heard in the court, save the sound of the witness's voice and the scratching of the clerk's pen. The verdict seemed almost foregone, although the defence strenuously argued that Sarah Ann's husband, Isaac, had coerced her into the poisoning plot. They also contended that Sarah Ann, due to her purported weak-mindedness and below-average intellect, was easily influenced. With the end of the evidence and trial, the judge summed up the evidence and charged the jury to do their duty. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News, the 10th of March 1905, Judge's Charge. His Lordship proceeded to sum up at length and recited to the jury the evidence given by the several witnesses in detail. An awful and revolting crime had been committed in their county. Could they have any doubt whatever in their minds, from the symptoms seen in the last moments of the old woman's life, and from what was found in her body after that she died from strychnine poisoning? And had they any doubt that it was the hand of Sarah Ann Pearson that administered the poison? Did they doubt the evidence of John Orr, the druggist, as to the sale of the poison? If they had any doubt whatever on their minds, the prisoner was entitled to the fullest benefit of the doubt. Had the jury any doubt in their minds that this woman knew when she bought the poison what she was doing and what the effect that poison would be? It was an awful crime. He could hardly find a parallel in his knowledge of crime in this county. If they found there was no room for any reasonable doubt, then they ought to do their duty in accordance with their oaths, and the jury retired at 6 o'clock. Verdict and sentence. On their return, there was a flutter of excitement in the crowded court, and the conversation which had previously prevailed was hushed. Having answered their names, the foreman of the jury, in reply to the clerk of the court, announced that they had found a verdict of guilty with a recommendation of mercy. His lordship, who was visibly moved, then passed sentence of death, the execution to take place on the 30th of March. The prisoner, who did not appear to thoroughly realize her awful position up at this stage, was removed from the dock, and as she disappeared from view down the steps of the dock, she was observed placing a handkerchief up to her eyes and was apparently weeping. Tomorrow morning, Agnes Black, the daughter of the deceased, will be put on trial, charged in connection with the poisoning of her mother. The following morning, Agnes Black, baby held tightly in her arms, is tried for the murder of her mother. Much of the evidence that comes out is a repeat from Sarah Ann's trial. The consensus seems to be that whilst Agnes had been trying to kill her mother slowly through repeated dosing with metallic mercury, Sarah Ann obtained the strychnine and fed it to Alice to finish her off. From the Irish News and Belfast Morning News, the 11th of March 1905, Judge's Charge. At the end of the trial, his lordship proceeded to invite the attention of the jury to the evidence in detail. It was, said the judge, a terrible and awful case they were trying. They were trying the case of a daughter charged with a crime horrible, unnatural, and revolting, the shortening or attempting to take away her mother's life by administering a noxious poison. Some remarkable testimony had been given in this case, and this, against other evidence, struck him as showing that Agnes Black, whether she committed that crime or not, was a woman of somewhat callous nature, and had not towards this old woman feelings that a daughter generally would, and towards a mother who had given her birth. Having dwelt at length upon the evidence, his lordship pointed out that the prisoner had voluntarily given her address in England to the police before leaving, so that it could not be suggested she was a fleeing of justice. During the last half hour of the wretched old woman's life, when she was expiring in agony, it did not appear that anyone was with her but her own daughter. What occurred during that half hour? It was proved that from the hour the prisoners came to live with their mother, the latter suffered from the cutting of the bowels, diarrhea. Purchases of mercury for the prisoner or by her were proved, and it was proved at the analysis that mercury was found in the old woman's stomach. The jury retired at 5:40 and returned with a verdict of guilty. Despite some sympathy for the woman, particularly Agnes, who looked a pathetic creature with her baby in her arms daily, the jury's decision led to a death sentence for Sarah Ann Pearson and life imprisonment for Agnes Black. Within the community, there was an immediate push to commute the death sentence. A comprehensive petition, eventually spanning 200 pages and signed by figures such as both archbishops, all jury members and witnesses, and a multitude of supporters, all pleaded for clemency. On the scheduled execution day, the inspectors of lunatics recommended mercy, advising the Lord Justices to commute her sentence to penal servitude for life. Consequently, she was granted a reprieve. As for Isaac, he was sentenced to 15 months hard labour, no doubt reduced due to his testimony regarding the murder of his mother. The murder of Alice Pearson in Armagh resounded in the community for decades. Case 4. The Scandalous Murder of William Whiteley, 1907. The very famous case of the shooting of William Whiteley in January 1907. Whiteley, at age 75 at the time of his murder, was very wealthy and a household name in England. The story of his being shot was shocking on its own. What created a media frenzy was that the man who shot Whiteley claimed to be his illegitimate son. As the story unfolds, it was hard to escape the innuendo of Whiteley in his position of hiring hundreds of young women in positions of sales staff for his department stores. And he had on several occasions taken advantage of his powerful position, most notably 2 sisters who both allegedly had children by him. One of the alleged children seemed to have turned murderous. The background. Who was William Whiteley? William Whiteley, 1831 to 1907, was a British entrepreneur and businessman known for founding the famous Whiteley's department store in London. Whiteley's, established in 1863, was one of the first department stores in the world and played a significant role in shaping the retail landscape of its time. William Whiteley focused on providing a wide range of goods under one roof, creating a shopping destination that catered to various needs and preferences. His department store became known for its opulent design and innovative retail concepts. At the time of the event, Whiteley was 75 years old and a household name in terms of riches. 2 sisters. The 2 sisters, Emily and Louisa Turner, are at the heart of the unfolding events. Emily Turner, the oldest sister, had worked for William Whiteley. Emily was under the protection of George Rayner. This was a euphemism at the time for being kept by another acting as a mistress. Emily had a son who was christened Horace George Rayner. The father of Horace was unclear. Was it George Rayner or was it William Whiteley, with George Rayner being a protective mask for the relationship between the two? Emily's younger sister, Louisa, also worked for William Whiteley. and within 2 months of her employment, Whiteley had seduced her and persuaded her to go and live under his protection. Whiteley took on a house in the name of Rayner, where elder sister Emily lived with her younger sister Louisa. Also within the house was Emily's partner, George Rayner, and her son, Horace. The scandal. Two sisters who worked for Whiteley living together in a house paid for by Mr. Whiteley looked bad indeed. Coincidentally, Whiteley's wife had also worked for him before they were married. Both sisters had worked for him, and it was speculated but not proven that both sisters had been in a relationship with him. Both sisters had children. Now, one of the two children who had grown up had shot the man he believed to be his father, business tycoon William Whiteley. The scandal and its impact on the business was overwhelming. Whiteley, who had nicknamed himself as the Great Provider in reference to his department store, now saw that moniker in reference to the sisters and children. Questions also arose to how busy Whiteley had been with other staff members. The stores hired hundreds of young girls as shop assistants. From the People, the 13th of June 1926, William Whiteley shot down by a man claiming to be his son. Who would ever forget the sensational news that flashed through London like wildfire on a bitterly cold day in January 1907, when it became known that the wealthy proprietor of the great Bayswater stores, which bore his name, had been shot dead in his own office by a man claiming to be his illegitimate son. Here, right on its own doorsill, the public found itself supplied direct with the choicest thing that could possibly be found in the way of scandal, and, to add piquancy to the dish, provided by the man who styled himself the universal provider. For scandal it was, of the worst imaginable description, when the romantic details gradually came to light. It seemed almost incredible. Here was a man, a notable public figure, almost Gladstonian in his massive personality, known by name to hundreds of thousands of people who crowded into his massive establishment in Queen's Road, Bayswater, found to be involved in a life more appropriate to an Eastern potentate than to a 20th century product of Occidental commerce. And yet, the drama that gradually unfolded bore no lack of embellishment. From every point of view, it was a most unsavoury revelation of a double life of a man who in his business employed thousands of girls and had apparently utilized the opportunity to behave in a manner more befitting the barbarian races of the Orient. The crime. From the Pall Mall Gazette, 24th of January 1907, Mr. William Whiteley shot dead. The Press Association is informed by the Daily Chronicle that Mr. William Whiteley, the universal provider of Westbourne Grove, was shot dead this morning by a man who afterwards committed suicide by shooting himself. The Press Association adds, it appears that about 10 minutes past 1 o'clock, Mr. Whiteley was in his shop when a man approached him and, drawing a revolver, shot him dead in the presence of assistants and a number of customers. The assailant afterwards turned the revolver on himself and fired. Whether with fatal effect is not yet known. The shop was at once cleared and the police and medical assistance summoned, but Mr. Whiteley was already beyond human aid. Whiteley, the victim, was dead. but the murderer, Horace George Rayner, still clung on to life. With care, Horace pulls through, but he is disfigured for life. From the Daily Mirror, the 23rd of March, 1907. Quite apart from the facts of the case, Rayner's appearance in the dock was bound to evoke much sympathy. The self-inflicted shot had completely destroyed his right eye, and it was obvious to everyone in court that throughout the day of his trial he was in great pain. The shot had inflicted such injuries that hardly for a moment from the time of its being fired had he been set free from pain. The prison officers said he had suffered agonies during the time of his confinement. His hair was combed straight back from an intellectual forehead, and he possessed a small, shapely mouth and clearly defined eyebrows which were good to look upon. But the right side of his face was a pathetic wreck, with the blind eye, the deep dent in the nose, and the powder-discoloured flesh. Once Rayner was well enough, the case went to court. The trial took place at the Old Bailey on Friday, March 18th, 1907, before Lord Ulverston, then Lord Chief Justice of England, probably the strongest and most domineering personality that has ever sat upon the English bench. In this case, as in that of Crippen, which he tried some years later, his personality dominated the proceedings. There was no question as to the guilt of Rayner. The issue was whether Rayner had been insane at the time or the mitigating circumstances surrounding the event. Prisoner Horace George Rayner's testimony, his simple story. For the first time, a flush of excitement reddened the prisoner's pale face when late in the afternoon he went into the witness box to tell the story of the fateful interview with Whiteley on January the 24th, the afternoon of the murder. He gave his evidence calmly and straightforward. He spoke deliberately, weighing each word before he uttered it. His voice was pleasant and refined, and his manner that of a man who was telling the truth. His story was simple enough. A desperate man who had heard enough of the mystery of his birth to believe he was the son of the millionaire shopkeeper. He had decided to make an appeal to his supposed father's generosity. This appeal failed. The game was up. He had resolved, in case of failure, to blow out his brains. He produced the revolver and told Mr. Whiteley he should shoot himself. The resolute old man sent for a policeman. Rayner went mad with anger, and in his rage fired the shots which killed the rich tradesman and left himself wrecked and disfigured for the vengeance of the law. Very possibly Rayner spoke the truth, if not the whole truth, but true or untrue, the story was not one which would influence the decision of an English jury, nor did the prisoner appear to expect it. From the first, he seemed to have given up all concern for his fate, and when the sentence came, he did not flinch. Rayner's evidence. Rayner told his counsel that from his earliest years he had always been known by the name of Horace George Rayner, and he always regarded Miss Emily Turner as his mother, and up to a certain point, Mr. George Rayner as his father. Rayner went on to say that in his early days he remembered living in a house in Grenville Place in Kilburn, but he could not tell how long he was there. He used to see Mr. Whiteley at breakfast every morning. Rayner went on to say he also remembered being in Brighton, and there again he saw Mr. Whiteley, his mother, and Mr. George Rayner. After that, he went to boarding school, and that was about 1896.
Finally, said Rayner, when he left school, he went to reside with Mr. Rayner at his chambers in King William Street, Charing Cross. That would be when he was about 15 years of age. He did not know where his mother was. She had left Rayner then. Rayner used to tell him when he was in drink that he was no son of his. He told him that on more than one occasion, and that he ought to go and see Mr. Whiteley, as he had more claim on him as a son. He continued, At 17 I went to Russia. I helped Mr. Rayner in his office. Rayner added that he was at Riga for 7 months, and when he returned home and went to Mr. Rayner again, after a while he left owing to a difference of opinion. He went to Bewdley, then to Leeds, and then to Birmingham. Then he got a post as private secretary to Sir Henry Burdett. He was then connected with the Gordon Hotels, with whom he remained for 3.5 years. He left owing to a change in the directorate. No regular employment. He continued, I borrowed some money from my wife's aunt and started a business as a commission agent in the city. At the end of 1905, I went to Russia again, where I was for 4 months. When I returned, I was unable to get regular employment, and things went from bad to worse. I had to pawn, and it made me a little erratic, and I had to go a good deal without food.
The build-up to the event. Rayner explained, I think and still considered that I had ample grounds for calling on Mr. Whiteley for assistance, at least of the kind for which I asked. I decided last Christmas to blow my brains out when I was at Rowton House, but I had not the money to get the revolver, which was in pledge. My mother had told me before her death that if ever I was in want, and I went to Mr. Whiteley and mentioned her name, he would assist me. For 2 weeks I debated whether I should go to him, having regard to the fact that it was many years since I had seen him. At last I thought I would do so, and that in the event of my failure I would commit suicide. Under these circumstances I went down to see him. I had on that morning several glasses of brandy, as I did not know really whether I was justified in putting to myself such a gamble, my own life against his good will, as it were. However, I decided to go. I decided beforehand that if I blew my brains out, no one should discover my identity for the sake of my wife and family and the scandal that might arise. For that reason, I left my papers at the tube station. I knew if I gave my own name I should not get to Mr. Whiteley, so I gave that of Sir George Lewis. As soon as I got access to Mr. Whiteley, I told him that I had gained access under false pretences, and that my name was Horace George Rayner. He, William Whiteley, said, "Oh, yes, sit down." We sat facing each other. He said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "I believe I am right in saying, Mr. Whiteley, that your son is speaking to his father." He said, "Is that so? When did you see me last?" I mentioned the circumstances that I had seen him at Hove, and there saw him last. I mentioned the desperate straits in which I was, but I made no proposition with regard to helping me. He asked what business I had been brought up to, and I told him a clerk. He said I ought to have had a more useful occupation. After talking some time without getting much nearer the object of my visit, I put it to him, "Can you assist me in any way?
I shall be pleased if only I can get employment. I mentioned no question of money. He said, I must not mix myself up with what has passed. Of course, it is all very fine, but there are two sides to every question, and you have heard one side. I made no comment. He asked if I wanted to go abroad. I said I should be glad, but that I could do nothing without capital. He said many young men did well abroad without capital, and told me to go to the Salvation Army emigration offices. I was nettled at this, to think that he should have so little sentiment for a blood relation. I asked him if he absolutely refused to help me, and he said I must not. I said I have made up my mind to blow out my brains, and he said, Don't talk silly. I produced the revolver and put it to my head. He said, Put that thing down. I staggered for a moment. I had a feeling of revulsion against Mr. Whiteley. My head was in a whirl. I thought, if he is not amenable to sentiment and sense of duty, perhaps he may be amenable to a sense of fear. I made up my mind that I wouldn't play that card, but without any intention of carrying it to effect. I tore some leaves from my book and began to write. After I had written the best part of it, Mr. Whiteley got up and went toward the door. I asked if he would stop. He took no notice. I got up to see what had become of him and saw him standing outside. It occurred to me that he had thought he could wait outside to hear me shoot myself. I think my mind was not improved by the knowledge of that fact. I went towards him and extended my hand in a friendly way, and asked him to come in again and not leave the matter like that. He said, I have sent for a policeman. That is all I remember of the circumstances. The actual shooting and what was on my mind at the time, I know nothing about. The prisoner went silent. His remarkable story was at an end. There was no cross-examination. Victorian paper. The notes to which he had written prior to the shooting were produced. The words were to whom it may concern. William Whiteley is my father, and has brought upon himself and me a double fatality by reason of his refusal of a request perfectly reasonable. R.I.P. The courtroom was gripped by the tale of this young man who had gone for help in his hour of need to the man he thought was his father. The unfortunate Whiteley family, anxious for the well-being of the business, strained every nerve to hush up the sordid scandal as much as they could, as waves of sympathy extended out to the unfortunate Horace Rayner. The Sisters' Testimony. From the Daily Mirror, the 23rd of March, 1907. The Romance of Two Sisters. The name of Louisa Turner, the prisoner's aunt, was called, and there was a buzz of excited anticipation in the crowded court. Tall, slim, dressed almost entirely in black, and wearing a pince-nez, she stepped into the box and began her evidence in a quiet, even voice. Miss Louisa Turner told the story of his birth, and the manner in which Mr. Whiteley had entered into the lives of her and her sister. She stated that her sister Emily had a son in April 1879, and identified the birth certificate of that son, the prisoner Horace George Rayner. Her sister, she said, was then living with George Rayner, but left him later and died in 1898. She stated how she herself had entered into the service of William Whiteley on November the 15th, 1882. On January the 15th, 1883, she went to live at Grayville Road, Kilburn, under William Whiteley's protection. On September the 15th, she, Louisa, had a son by William Whiteley. His name is Cecil Whiteley. Louisa went on to describe that George Rayner had been acting as the husband of her sister about a year before Horace had been born. Her understanding had been that George Rayner was the father of Horace. She had not been aware that George Rayner had repudiated his being the father. She went on to say that she and her sister had been on good terms until the quarrel with Mr. Whiteley. She described how she and William Whiteley had quarrelled around May 1888, and they separated. They had not lived together since then. She had seen George Rayner a few times since the split with Whiteley. The rooms in Grenville Road were originally taken furnished by Mr. Whiteley in the name of Rayner. The apartments were taken in the name of Rayner as well, and she and her sister and Mr. Rayner were all supposed to live there together. The quarrel. The quarrel between her and Mr. Whiteley had been from his suspicion that she had had relations with George Rayner. The charge was untrue and was withdrawn on Rayner's threat of legal proceedings. Lastly, to confirm the terrible financial straits that the prisoner Horace Rayner had found himself and his family in, came the testimony of his wife. From the Daily Mirror, the 23rd of March 1907, the evidence of Mrs. Alice May Rayner, the prisoner's wife. Mrs. Alice May Rayner, the prisoner's wife, gave evidence. She said that the prisoner, her husband, was variable in his moods, but for the assistance of her aunts, she and her children would have been destitute, as her husband had been very hard up since his return from Russia. He had tried hard to get work, and his failure affected his temper and made him sleepless. An attempt was made of temporary insanity by the defence, but this was effectively quashed by the prosecution team. The jury was left with no choice but to give a verdict of guilty. The judge, Lord Alveston, had no choice but to pass sentence of death on Horace George Rayner. Guilty or not guilty, and as Rayner had already confessed to the murder, there could be no alternative to the verdict of guilty. The Lord Chief sentenced Rayner to death, and then arose a most astonishing state of affairs. Public sympathy for the accused man. Whether he was in fact an illegitimate son of William Whiteley, no one will ever know. The secret of his parentage is forever locked in the breast of his dead mother. But with the facts from the trial released in the press concerning William Whiteley's early liaisons, a wave of sympathy for the assassin ran throughout the whole country. Intense public sympathy went out to the man who had committed the murder, Horace George Rayner. A petition for Rayner's reprieve was got up and supported wholeheartedly by the press of the country. Crowds clamoured to sign it, and Mr. Pearson's office was besieged. He had to suspend all other work and make special addresses for its signature. Hundreds of thousands of people employed in factories and offices, from the managers down to the office boy, signed the petition for Rayner's reprieve. As the time for it being presented grew near, the crowds increased, and it became obvious that if Horace Rayner was hanged, there would be a public outcry such as had never been seen before. The Home Secretary, realising the extent of public feeling, wisely reprieved the prisoner and commuted the sentence to one of penal servitude for a term of 20 years. Sir Richard Muir, the prosecutor, was not at all upset that this took place. In common with nearly everybody, he felt that Rayner had been a victim of circumstances and one whose mind had become unbalanced by his supposed grievances. As events turned out, Rayner paid the price of his crime, and within a relatively short time he came back to the world as a free man. He served 12 years of his sentence and died a couple of years after being released. Despite the tragic end to William Whiteley's life, his legacy continued through the department store. In 1927, the Whiteley department store business was sold to Harry Selfridge. Case 5. The Regent Square Murder, 1917. In this episode, it is 1917 in London. In the early morning hours, the workers of London begin their daily work. A sweeper in Regent Square notices a bit of material which appears blood-stained. Upon closer examination, he sees a foot and half a leg protruding. Scotland Yard were immediately called in to the Regent Street murder, which was remarkable for its sheer brutality. The head and hands were missing from the corpse, and the parts had been disjointed by someone who knew what they were doing. This fascinating case was the talk of London. On the body was a cryptic note saying "Bloody Belgium," but with unique spelling. On the 2nd of November in the early hours, a street cleaner in posh Regent Square notices a bundle in sacking that has been placed over the railings of the gardens. Investigating closer, he opens the sacking to find blood-stained sheeting with what looks to be body parts of a decapitated woman. Other than an expensive vest, she is without clothing. From the Sheffield Independent, the 3rd of November 1917, Headless Woman, Grim Mystery of a London Square. The mutilated body of murder was found in Regent Square in London yesterday, and the most able detectives of Scotland Yard are at present engaged in trying to trace the murderer. The crime is of a particularly brutal nature. The murderer, after killing his victim, cut the body and severed the head from the trunk. The body, which has not yet been identified, is that of a woman of about 30 years of age. Just inside some railings enclosing a garden, a man was attracted by seeing a white sheet and pieces of sacking. The sheet was blood-stained, and protruding from it was a woman's foot and half her leg. He at once raised the alarm, and after removing the sacking, the police lifted the corner of the sheet and disclosed the terribly mutilated body of a woman. The body was lying on its side, said an eyewitness, and one leg, which had been severed at the knee, was alongside. There was no head, and both hands, which had been cut off at the wrists, were also missing. But for vest or chemise, beautifully embroidered, the dead woman was unclothed. The police found also on the sheet a piece of paper which had been written in pencil 2 words, "Bloody Belgian." That the murderer is a person of considerable anatomical knowledge is certain. The head and limbs have been severed with a sharp instrument by a skilled hand. Death could not have occurred hours before the discovery, for rigor mortis had not yet set in, and the blood on the sheet and limb were quite fresh. Inquiries towards midnight elicited the fact that no arrests had been made and no clue likely to lead to an immediate solution of the mystery had developed. Scotland Yard are called in, and with forensics and investigative methodology, they are able to quickly develop leads to find the murderer, despite
not being able to yet identify the body without the head and the hands. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 3rd of November 1917, murder mystery deepens. 3 important new clues. Who was she? Police describe the victim. Deep though the mystery surrounding the Regent Square murder still is, the police today are more hopeful of solving the problem confronting them. 3 very important circumstances of the crime tend to lead their inquiries along definite lines. These clues may be set out as follows. 1. The sheeting which contained the decapitated body and the outer covering of sacking were many yards of textiles known as longcloth, a stuff practically exclusively used by butchers. The fabric, which is of the muslin variety, is used in the butchering trade for wrapping carcasses for storage. Evidently, this longcloth, a piece which bears a circular trademark stamp Argentine La Pleto Cold Storage, had been swathed around the sheet for the purpose of keeping outer covering sacking as clean as possible, and very obviously too had been added hastily as an afterthought. 2. The amputation of the limbs has been performed in a manner suggesting the work of a butcher used to work of jointing beasts, rather than that of a surgeon. The limbs had been disjointed rather than surgically amputated, yet disjointed with such skill as would suggest a practised hand. 3. Clinging to the interior of one of the covering parts of the remains were lumps of bran, which is, of course, largely used by farmers for fattening sheep. Many of these bran sacks, when they are emptied, pass on from the farmer to the meat market and thence to a butcher's shop, and as the police have the number of this sack, D3118, they are hopeful that they may succeed in tracing its recent history. In addition to the number, the label on the sack bears the inscription Joseph Rank Limited, Premier Flour Mills, Broad Brand, Victoria Dock, London. The laundry mark. The laundry mark on the white twill sheets in which the remains of the body were wrapped also affords a clue of interest, and already the police have received certain information in this connection. The mark, which was in cotton, was a roughly formed 11H, and this morning at one laundry not far from Regent Square, the proprietress discovered amongst the linen waiting to be called for a package containing several garments bearing this mark. It is not our mark, she explained, but 2 of my customers living at the one address have most of their linen marked in this way. They usually call in midweek for their clean linen, but as yet this week they have not come in. At another laundry in the district visited by the police, the same mark was discovered on a small handkerchief stitched in blue. This article was part of a parcel which had been in the laundry some time to be called for, but visiting the address supplied by the proprietress, the police found that the owner of the linen was alive and in no possible way connected with the affair. At Scotland Yard, the Pall Mall Gazette representative was asked to describe minutely the sheet in which the body was found, in the hope that someone may be able to throw some light upon the mystery. It is 8 foot by 6 inches and made of twill. The mark 11H, it is suggested, is possibly not that of a laundry at all, but the private mark of a lodging or boarding house, or even a private hotel. The police also issued a constructive description of the victim. The victim described: she is about 5 foot in height and was evidently in good health, said one of the officers engaged on the case. Obviously, she had lived
in good circumstances, for not only is the body clean and well nourished, but the toenails have evidently been regularly pedicured. A woman has been reported missing who fits the description of the torso found in Regent Square. Additionally, by following the trail of clues found at the scene, the police are led to the home of a French butcher as a possible suspect. He is visited and brought in for questioning. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 5th of November 1917, man detained pending inquiries. The mystery of Regent Square is still unsolved, though the police are rapidly developing a number of important clues. The body of the victim, it is officially stated today, has not been definitively identified. It is known that a Mrs. Gerard is missing from an address in the vicinity of Munster Square, and the police are trying to trace her. The man detained is a butcher. The circumstances under which the man was detained are described by the London news agency as follows. Chief Inspector Wensley and Detective Inspector Ashley went to his house in Charlotte Street. The man himself answered the knock at the door. "We are police officers," the detective said, "and are making inquiries in reference to the murder of a woman, part of whose remains were found on Friday morning. We propose to detain you on suspicion of having been concerned in it." The man answered readily, "I know nothing about it. I'm innocent." He was told that he would have to accompany the officers to Bow Street pending inquiries. Meanwhile, detectives are pursuing certain lines of investigation, and it is anticipated that it will shortly be definitely establishing that the dead woman was the wife of a French soldier named Gerard, who had been missing from her apartment near Munster Square since last Wednesday. To escape air raids. Mrs. Gerard was of a nervous disposition, and it was originally thought that she had left London in order to escape air raids. Nobody, however, seems to have received any tidings of her since she left, and the police are coming to the conclusion that the body is hers, as its description tallies in almost every respect with that of the missing woman. Describing Mrs. Gerard, a neighbour said, "I do not think she was particularly happy. Sometimes she seemed to me as if she had been crying for hours. She had a depressed expression, and whenever she spoke to me, I could not help being struck with the mournfulness of her conversation. Once or twice I have seen her in the company of a middle-aged man who, she said, was a relative of hers." Scarred Hands story. Mr. Morgan, a dairyman of Langford Street, close to Munster Square, said, "Madame Gerard was a pretty little woman with a mass of fair hair. She was often absent for a few days at a time, and on her return stated that she had been visiting her husband in France. On several occasions she exhibited her hands to various people, including my wife. These hands were heavily scarred, apparently from burns. Neither the hands nor the head of the victim has yet been discovered." Living in the same basement as the butcher under remand is a 30-ish old woman, also a French speaker, and widow named Bertha Roche. Both Voisin and Roche are reminded. In the meantime, Scotland Yard combs through their 2-room basement, and there, in a washtub, they find the head and hands of a woman, suspected of being the missing body parts of Mademoiselle Gerard. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 7th of November 1917, The Square Murder. Man and woman in court. Inspector's story. Voisin's voluntary statement. Following upon the inquest revelations in connection with the headless and dismembered body found in Regent Square, Bloomsbury, last Friday, Louis-Marie Joseph Voisin, stableman aged 50 of Charlotte Street, Fitzroy Square, and Bertha Roche, aged 31, housekeeper, also of Charlotte Street, were charged at Marlborough Street today with being concerned together in the murder of Emmeline Gerard. Voisin preceded his companion into the dock. Both had spent the night in Tottenham Court Road Police Station. The small court was uncomfortably crowded, the space allotted to the public being filled with spectators. The male prisoner was wearing what appeared to be drab-coloured butcher's overall and a pair of black leggings. He is a man of heavy build and medium height, with dark, heavy moustache. His companion is slim and of pale complexion. She was wearing a dark grey raincoat and a black hat trimmed with white roses. Both prisoners were allowed to be seated, and between them in the dock sat a police officer. Mr. Barrington Matthews defended the woman, and the man was unrepresented. Inspector's story. Chief Detective Inspector Wensley, Scotland Yard, at once entered the witness box, and his evidence was interpreted sentence by sentence into French for the benefit of the accused. He said, "At about 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, November the 3rd, I went with Divisional Detective Inspector to the first floor of number 50 Munster Square, where the deceased woman, Madame Gerard, occupied 2 rooms. In consequence, what we saw and what we believed, we went with Superintendent McCarthy to 101 Charlotte Street, and we saw the 2 prisoners who are cohabiting and who occupy a basement at that address. Superintendent McCarthy spoke to them, and Voisin then accompanied Divisional Detective Inspector Ashley to Bow Street Police Station. On Sunday, with Inspector Ashley, I took a statement from Voisin with the aid of Detective Sergeant Reed acting as an interpreter. On Monday, November the 5th, I caused Madame Roche to be brought to Bow Street Police Station with Detective Sergeant Cooper and Detective Reed, the same interpreter. I took a statement from her. After that statement had been taken, I went to 101 Charlotte Street and there saw in a small tub, which stood in a larger one in a cellar connected with the basement, the head and hands of a woman, which had just been discovered by Sergeant Collins. A voluntary statement. While these gruesome details were being related to the female prisoner, trembled. Inspector Wensley continued, they have since been found belonging to the mutilated body which was found in Regent Square the morning of November the 2nd. Yesterday I conveyed the prisoners from Bow Street, Tottenham Court Road Police Station and charged them with the wilful murder of Madame Gerard. That charge was interpreted to them by Sergeant Quantrell. They made a reply in French to him. Later, Voisin made a voluntary statement which was interpreted and written by Detective Sergeant Reed, and Voisin signed it. This was all the evidence Inspector Wensley proposed to offer at this stage, and the magistrate inquired if the accused wished to put any questions. Through the interpreter, Voisin replied, "I repeat what I say and I said last night." Mr. Denman responded, "You will have plenty of opportunities for going into that. All I want to know at present is whether you wish to ask any questions about the arrest." Voisin replied in the negative, and Mr. Barrington Matthews reserved any questions which he might wish to put on behalf of the woman, and 7 days' remand was ordered. The husband of the deceased Madame Gerard is found and brought to London for help with Scotland Yard's investigations. He confirms that he knew
Monsieur Voisin, indeed his wife, the now deceased Madame Gerard, supposedly worked for him at some time. Items found in the possession of Monsieur Voisin and Bertha Roche are brought forward and identified by Monsieur Gerard as having belonged either to himself or his now deceased wife. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 12th of November 1917, The Square Murder, resumed inquest on the dead Frenchman. Mr. Walter Schroeder, the St. Pancras coroner, today resumed the inquest on Mrs. Emmeline Gerard, a French subject, whose mutilated body was found in Regent Square, Gray's Inn Road, on the morning of November the 8th, and in connection with which a man and a woman, also French subjects, are on remand charged with murder. Detective Sergeant McBride produced a book containing 18 photographs taken by him of Regent Square 101 Charlotte Street, where the accused resided, and the house in Munster Square where Mrs. Gerard lived. Another Scotland Yard official produced plans of the basement of the Charlotte Street house and the cellar where the head and hands of the dead woman were found. The coroner's officer called Mr. Gerard, and a smart-looking man attired in black stepped into the witness box. He gave his name as Manuel Julien Gerard and his evidence in perfect English. He said he was a private in the regiment now fighting in France. He was previously a cook. His wife was 30 years of age, and they had been married about 7 years and had no family. He had been in France since July 1916. When he left England, his wife was residing at 30 Munster Square, occupying 2 rooms on the first floor. She had not many friends, and he had only one male friend who visited the house. His wife communicated with him every other day after he left for France, and in August 1916 she told him by letter that she was working as a cook in a small restaurant or shop in Charlotte Street. Later, she wrote that she had obtained work at 101 Charlotte Street, where she is employed by a Monsieur Voisin. Latterly, his wife's letters were not so frequent. In them, she occasionally mentioned Voisin, saying how good he was to her. She said she was working but no longer in Voisin's employment. She occasionally mentioned the name of a woman named Marguerite, whom he met once during his visit to England. He identified belonging to either to himself or his wife a gentleman's gold watch and a chain, a silver matchbox, a lady's gold watch, a gold necklace, a gold ring with a single diamond, a plain gold wedding ring, a lady's small diamond ring, and a lady's purse bag. He also identified 2 post office saving bank books in his own name and the other in his wife's. Both books were kept at 30 Munster Square. He next identified a brooch comprised of 3 gilt threepenny pieces, a purse belonging to his wife, and 3 keys which belonged to him. A black skirt and a pair of white shoes he was shown at Scotland Yard belonged, he said, to his wife, and a hearth rug with a couple of holes in it used to be beside his bed at Munster Square. Scotland Yard's investigations continue as the 2 prisoners are kept remanded. A picture is emerging of motive with the discovery of several items belonging to Monsieur and Madame Gerard, discovered on the premises of the couple. The motive is further compounded with highly affectionately termed warm postcards found in the possession from Madame Gerard and Monsieur Voisin, as well as an IOU for £50, worth over £4,000 in 2024, signed by Monsieur Voisin to Madame Gerard.
From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 28th of November 1917. The Sack Murder, Police Discover and IOU. Louis Voisin and Bertha Roche were again brought up at Marlborough Street today, charged with being concerned in the death of Emmeline Gerard, whose mutilated body was found in Regent Square Gardens this morning on the morning of the 1st inst. Voisin, who is still unrepresented, stepped briskly into the dock, but Roche was very pale and showed signs of much weakness. Mr. Rouse, wife of the leaseholder of number 50 Munster Square, where Madame Gerard and her husband lived for over a year, and her daughter, both gave evidence as to Voisin paying frequent visits to the deceased after her husband had gone to the front. He usually went there in a trap. Miss Rouse stated that 2 days after the body was found, Voisin came to the house and said Madame Gerard had gone to the country for a fortnight. Witness related that he searched Madame Gerard's house and found what appeared to be a lover's postcard. He also found an IOU signed Louis Voisin, and in his opinion the signature was the same as that which appeared on the prisoner's statement. The document was read as follows: London, August 15th, 1917. I acknowledge having received the sum of £50 from Madame Emmeline Gerard for a period of 3 months, from August the 15th, 1917 to November the 15th, 1917, for which I have paid her as interest a sum of £2 paid in advance. Louis Voisin, 101 Charlotte Street. With the expensive jewellery taken that had been in the possession of Madame Gerard and the IOU for a considerable sum, it is easy to piece together a financial motive for the murder. But what of a possible romantic motive? Famed pathologist Dr. Spilsbury gives evidence of the injuries inflicted on Madame Gerard. Spilsbury also confirms that the items he had tested, including the butcher's apron owned by Voisin, had human blood upon them, not animal blood, as Voisin had claimed. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 13th of December 1917, the Regent Square Murder. How Madame Gerard's death was caused. Louis Voisin, aged 50, and Bertha Ross, aged 38, of Charlotte Street, were brought up again at Marlborough Street Police Court today in connection with the murder of Emmeline Gerard, whose mutilated body was found in Regent Square Gardens on November the 2nd. Dr. Salisbury, pathologist to St. Mary's Hospital, gave the result of examination of the remains. He said the severing of the limbs indicated some skill in disjointing bodies. Abrasions and bruises which he found on the limbs were inflicted before death. He could find no indication in the trunk of the cause of death. Describing the injuries to the head, Dr. Spilsbury said he found a large area of bruising. The cheekbone was fractured beneath this wound, and the bone of the orbit was fractured in 2 places. On the head were 3 deep wounds. Death was mainly due to loss of blood, but partly asphyxia had either preceded or accompanied the infliction of the injuries. There were many blows, evidently by a blunt instrument, and delivered with fairly considerable force. He concluded that the woman survived the injuries for half an hour. Bloodstains, which were found in Voisin's house in Charlotte Street and in Madame Gerard's house in Munster Square, were those of human blood. The case was further adjourned for a fortnight. Voisin himself is a strongly built man, and it is thought that if he had made the blow to Madame Gerard's head, it would not have taken 3 blows to kill her. With this evidence, attention is drawn to Bertha Roche. The night of the murder, London had been undergoing air raid alarms. Madame Gerard was known to be highly nervous during air raids. Could she, in her panic, have gone unannounced to Vaussin's basement for safety, only to unexpectedly find another living there? Bertha Roche. From the Pall Mall Gazette, the 2nd of January 1918, Regent Square murder. Accused man's statement in court, sent for trial. A sensational statement was made at Marlborough Police Court today by Louis-Marie Joseph Vaussin, aged 50, stableman, who, with Bertha Ross, aged 30, housekeeper, is charged with the wilful murder of Madame Emmeline Gerard at 101 Charlotte Street, Fitzroy Square, between October the 31st and November the 2nd. Vaussin, after the usual magisterial caution, said, "I wish to make a statement. Madame Roche is entirely innocent." On hearing this, Roche leant her head on the dock rail and burst into sobs. Vaussin added, "I wish to say that she is absolutely innocent and that all the things found at 101 Charlotte Street were taken from Madame Gerard's to my house. The murder was not committed at Charlotte Street, but at Regent, Munster Square." Chief Detective Inspector Wensley said Vaussin accepted the invitation to write the words "Bloody Belgium," and his inaccuracies in spelling were similar to those on the piece of brown paper with the same words found on Madame Gerard's body. The inspector thought the handwriting was the same. Remarking anybody could write the same, Vaussin inquired if the writing should be submitted to other persons to judge. The magistrate responded that the writing will be submitted to 12 other persons who will form a judgment upon it. The case goes to trial against Vaussin. Despite the prosecution's hazy theory of the initial crime of beating Madame Gerard actually having been committed by Bertha Roche, she is only charged as an accessory before and after the fact. Her trial is placed on hold while the full brunt of the murder charge is placed on Vaussin. Given the evidence and the expert dismemberment of the body made, as well as the warm letters, the jewellery that has been owned by Madame and Monsieur Gerard in the hands of Vaussin, and the IOU, the jury has little difficulty finding Vaussin guilty. From the Pall Mall Gazette, 18th of January 1918, Vaussin guilty, the murder of Madame Gerard. At the Old Bailey this afternoon, Louis-Marie Joseph Vaussin, aged 50, was found guilty of the murder of Madame Gerard and was sentenced to death. In his defence, Mr. May had suggested that the theory most consistent with the facts was that the prisoner, as the result of weakness or panic, or possibly because he wished to shield somebody else, had been betrayed into a course of concealment which had ended in his having to meet this charge. Mr. Justice Darling, in his summing up, said, "There has been no evidence which would justify the verdict being reduced to any other. It would have to be a verdict of guilty or not guilty on the charge of murder only." What was Vaussin doing on the night when it was alleged the murder was committed? In the statements which were made, there were serious discrepancies, and it was wise that he did not enter the witness box. Roche did not go into the box either, and when persons accused of a serious crime did not offer explanations, they must only blame themselves if the inferences were drawn. Vaussin appeals, mostly on the basis of legal technicalities with an impugnation of foreigner prejudice, but the appeal is immediately dismissed. Vaussin's execution is delayed whilst the trial of Madame Bertha Roche takes place. From the Pall Mall Gazette, 2nd of March 1918, Madame Roche's trial.
alleged accessory in the Sack murder case. Madame Bertha Roche, aged 39, pleaded not guilty. The Old Bailey today, when placed upon her trial, charged with being an accessory after the fact of the murder of Madame Gerard, whose mutilated remains were found in a sack in Regent Square. Vincent, Frenchman, had been sentenced to death in connection with the crime. The court was crowded, very large numbers of women being present. Every seat in the public gallery was occupied. Mr. E. D. Muir said the case for prosecution was that the prisoner did certain things which tended to delay or prevent Vincent being brought to justice. It was sufficient for the jury to come to their verdict apart from the question of motive. Counsel went into the details of the case and called attention to the fact that articles of jewellery belonging to the murdered woman were found upon the accused. Bertha Roche is found guilty and sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment. Vincent is hanged at Pentonville Prison on the 2nd of March 1918. Roche is sent to prison but is quickly deemed insane and sent to a mental institution. She dies there not long after, on the 22nd of March 1919. Case 6. The murder of Maple Greenwood in 1919. This famous case hails from the small town of Kidwelly in Carmarthenshire in Wales. A wealthy heiress, her solicitor husband, her unsuspected death, the grieving widower's marriage to a much younger woman 4 months after the funeral. On the surface, this sounds drearily simple, but the case remains unsolved. The husband was defended by the famous Sir Edward Marshall Hall, known as the Great Defender, due to his successful reputation.
Mabel and Harold Greenwood. Mabel Greenwood, née Bowater, came from the wealthy Bowater family of Bury Hall, Edmonton. She married a young solicitor from Yorkshire, Harold Greenwood. The couple moved to Llanelly in 1898 and settled in the large Rumsey in Kidwelly, just outside Llanelly. Greenwood starts up his own practice in the nearby town of Llanelly, and the couple had 4 children, the youngest daughter, Irene, 22, still living at home. Mabel was a popular member of the close community. She was a regular member of the local church and could be seen there every Sunday with her prayer book in hand. She was also an enthusiastic supporter of the village tennis and croquet clubs. Despite her frail health, Mabel was well liked. Greenwood's practice, however, was less successful than he had hoped. The town murmured about the types of clients that frequented his practice, the less desirable elements of society. Also, Greenwood was not as favourably looked upon in the community in general. It was noted that Greenwood did not have any male friend. He was not one of the lads meeting up with friends at the pub. Greenwood had a reputation as a person who liked to stir up mischief. The villagers spoke of his exceptional popularity with the opposite sex. Greenwood was a charmer. Still, money was not an issue for the family, as Mabel received a monthly income from her family inheritance, and the family lived comfortably. Health. Mabel, at 47 years of age, was considered to be in indifferent health. Looking older than her years, Mabel's hair was streaked with grey, and her face was prematurely lined. Mabel herself did not understand why her health was so precarious. Her good friend, Miss Phillips, who was 4 years older than herself, was still very attractive and energetic and did not look old. In 1919, Mabel had a series of mysterious fainting fits. Mabel had already been supposed to having a weak heart, and Mabel was prescribed accompanying medicine to support this diagnosis. Her doctor of 16 years, Dr. Griffith, believes her new fainting symptoms to be related to menopause. The change of life, as Dr. Griffiths described it, and prescribed further medication to relieve the symptoms. However, Mabel's health continued to slowly deteriorate, with no definite medical reason for her decline. The fateful day, 16th of June, 1919. Mabel missed church that day and quietly sat in the garden penning letters. It was remarked by those who saw her how tired she looked. The cook had prepared the traditional English Sunday lunch of a joint of meat and vegetables, and lunch was served around 1 o'clock. Mabel had bought a bottle of Burgundy a few days before to be served with the lunch. The meal was finished with a gooseberry tart with custard. At 3:30, Greenwood informed the staff that Mabel had diarrhea. At 4:30, afternoon tea was brought into the drawing room. And at 5 o'clock, Mabel and daughter Irene had a stroll around the garden, where Mabel suddenly complained of violent stomach spasms. Greenwood gave Mabel some brandy. Mabel immediately vomited it back up. Upon Dr. Griffith's arrival, he prescribed brandy and soda to her. He and Greenwood then played several games of clock golf on the lawn together, whilst Mabel, in a near state of collapse, rested. By 7 o'clock, Mabel had ceased vomiting, and Dr. Griffiths believed her to be better. He went home. Mabel's friend, Miss Phillips, came to call at around 8 o'clock. She was alarmed by Mabel's appearance and immediately called the district nurse, who lived nearby. Mabel had collapsed. The nurse, seeing medicine by her bedside, incorrectly assumed that it was medicine that had been given to Mabel for her heart condition, and gave Mabel a second dose. There was no impact on her health. This medicine, as well as a large number of other medicines that had been prescribed to Mabel, all vanished from sight shortly afterwards. Mabel's condition worsened throughout the evening. By midnight, Mabel's diarrhea was now uncontrollable. Mabel believed herself to be dying and stated to the district nurse, "If I don't recover, I would like my sister to look after the children and bring them up," referring specifically to Irene, who was still living at home. Seeing her mother's condition deteriorate, Irene, in a panic, asked her father, Greenwood, to go across the street and once again fetch Mabel's doctor, Dr. Griffiths. An hour went by with no Dr. Griffiths and no Greenwood. It came out later that Greenwood, instead of contacting Dr. Griffiths, had stayed on chatting to Griffiths' sister, Miss May Griffiths. Greenwood did not bring Dr. Griffiths, and remarking on his feeling tired, went to bed. Mabel's condition continued to worsen. The nurse was fearful for Mabel's life. She forcefully woke Greenwood and demanded he fetch the doctor. Greenwood returned almost immediately, stating that Dr. Griffiths was asleep and could not be roused. The nurse now left herself and succeeded in waking Dr. Griffiths, But it was too late. By 3:30 a.m., Mabel was dead. From Kidwelly History. Llanelli, 1920. A troubling incident unfolded in the Greenwood household last evening as Mrs. Greenwood's health took a sudden turn for the worse. Between the hours of 6:30 p.m. and 7, she became severely unwell, prompting her husband and daughter to assist her to her bedroom with great difficulty. In response to the distressing situation, Dr. Griffiths was urgently summoned to the Greenwood residence. Administering medication to alleviate her symptoms, the doctor learned from Mrs. Greenwood herself that a gooseberry tart had caused her discomfort in the past, as it seemingly did once again. However, concerns grew exponentially as Mrs. Greenwood's condition worsened. Previously diagnosed with a condition attributed to the natural process of menopause, her current symptoms of pain, vomiting, and diarrhea raised significant alarm amongst her family and medical attendants. Throughout the course of the night, the doctor was repeatedly called upon, attending to Mrs. Greenwood's needs and monitoring her precarious state. Yet it is the conduct of Mr. Greenwood during this fateful evening that has given rise to suspicion, as he now faces trial regarding his wife's subsequent demise. Particular scrutiny centres around his prolonged absence when sent to fetch the doctor. Reports indicate that Mr. Greenwood's delay in returning with or without Dr. Griffiths caused his daughter Irene to personally visit the doctor's residence to ascertain the reason behind the unexpected delay. Nurse Jones, who was attending to Mrs. Greenwood at the time, claimed that Mr. Greenwood was absent for nearly an hour. The aftermath. The district nurse who had attended Mabel's, Nurse Jones, was unhappy how the events had unfolded, ending in Mabel's death. Kidwelly was a small village, and Mabel had been a popular member of the community, with her husband Greenwood very much less so. News of Mabel's death travelled fast. People in the community commented on how she had seemed all right not so long ago. It was also remarked how very quickly her death had taken place. Eventually, members of the village whispered, "Murder." Death certificate. Dr. Griffiths certified Mabel's death as being due to the heart disease. The vast number of pills that Mabel had were considered by Nurse Jones and Mabel's friend, Miss Phillips, either accidentally or intentionally. Greenwood had forgotten to send the formal death certificate to the vicar, as was the norm, and the village vicar was now also suspicious. With the village only talking about Mabel's unexpected death and Greenwood's known philanderings, the police felt they had no option but to become involved. Witness statements were taken which would be used later in court. The second marriage. However, much scandal was surrounding Greenwood at this time. He seemed to take no notice. 4 months after Mabel's funeral, Greenwood ignored the expected propriety of bereavement and announced his second marriage to a woman in her 30s, Miss Gladys Jones. The announcement came through the formal request to the Llanelli registrar, as was legally required. A letter that Harold had written to his wished-for bride-to-be was revealed in court. My dearest May, I have been trying hard to get you this last fortnight, but no luck. Always someone going in or you were out. Now, I want you to think very carefully and to send me over a reply tonight. There are very many rumours about, but between you and I, this letter reveals the true position. Well, it is only right that you should know that Miss Bowater, Mabel's sister, and Miss Phillips, Mabel's good friend, between them have turned my children against you very bitterly. Why, I don't know. It is only right that you should know this, as you are the one I love most in this world, and I would be the last one to make you unhappy. Under the circumstances, are you prepared to face the music? I am going to do something quickly, as I must get rid of Miss Bowater at once, as I am simply fed up with her. Let me have something from you tonight. Yours, as ever, Harold. The letter would be used by the prosecution to add to Greenwood's suspected motive of killing his wife. Miss Jones agreed to be his wife, and the now new Mrs. Greenwood was installed into the family home by September 1919. Mabel had died in June 1919. The previous village gossip, which had been under the surface, now became a clamour. In October 1919, Greenwood was informed that there would be an exhumation of Mabel. Greenwood's cheerful response was, "Just the very thing. I am quite agreeable." However, this was delayed. March 1920, the exhumation took place. June 1920, the inquest took place. What was remarkable was the strange state of preservation of Mabel's body was found to be in. Mabel, it was found, had 1.25 grain of arsenic in her body. Arsenic was known to delay decomposition of the body. Greenwood did not attend the inquest, but had there instead a representative. The inquest was well attended by many from the village. With the findings of the arsenic in the body, as well as the neighbourhood clamour, the jury found unanimously that the death of Mabel Greenwood had been caused by arsenical poisoning, and they were unanimously of the opinion that the poison had been administered by Harold Greenwood. Greenwood was arrested and taken to jail. The trip to the jail required an armed escort, as the villagers came out in droves to boo and hiss Greenwood. From the Dundee Evening Telegraph, 17th of June 1920. Harold Greenwood before the magistrate. Today's scene in the Kidwelly exhumation drama. Prisoner asks Scotland Yard man what verdict jury returned. Sensation crowded on sensation in the final hour of the amazing inquest on exhumed remains of Mrs. Greenwood, who died a year ago. Her husband, Mr. Harold Greenwood, a well-known solicitor of Kidwelly, is now in custody of the police, and today he appeared at Clonelly Court, charged with the murder of his wife, who was sister to Sir Vansittart Bowater, ex-Lord Mayor of London. The proceedings were formal and a remand was ordered. It was on the 16th of June 1919 that Mrs. Greenwood died, so that her husband was arrested on the first anniversary. Accused demeanour in court. Llanelli, Thursday. Another stage in the attempt to unravel the mystery of the death of Mrs. Mabel Greenwood, whose body was exhumed in April last, was reached today when Harold Greenwood, the Kidwelly solicitor and the husband of the late Mrs. Greenwood, was charged before the Llanelli bench with the wilful murder of his wife. At the inquest yesterday, a verdict was returned to the effect that the deceased died from arsenical poisoning, and the poison was administered by the accused. For the sake of convenience, the hearing of the case today took place in the charge room at the local police station, the available space being entirely occupied by newspaper representatives. A crowd of some hundreds of people thronged the narrow thoroughfares outside for some considerable time. The accused's demeanour. Greenwood stood in the small room facing the magistrate by the side of a plain-clothes officer. He was dressed in his usual style of a grey tweed coat with light check in riding breeches, dove-coloured leggings and light brown boots. He stood impassively with his hands clasped behind his back all the time he was in court, now and then directing his glance to the crowd, which could be clearly seen outside the window. The proceedings were formal, and only evidence of arrest was given, remand being ordered until Friday next. The charge. Mr. Seward Pierce, for the Director of Public Prosecutions, said the prisoner was charged with wilful murder of his wife on June 16th last year. So far as these proceedings were concerned, he proposed to limit them, offering formal evidence of arrest and then applying for a remand for the recognised period of 8 days. Chief Inspector Haig of Scotland Yard stated, "At 4:30 p.m. on June the 16th, I went to the house of Police Sergeant Lewis in Kidwelly. In a back room there I saw the prisoner detained by Sergeant Lewis and another officer. I said to him, 'I am Chief Inspector Haig. You know me. A coroner's jury has just returned verdict of murder against you. It is my duty to arrest you and charge you with the wilful murder of Mabel Greenwood on June the 16th, 1919. You will be taken to Llanelli, where you will appear before the magistrate tomorrow. I have to caution you that anything you may say will be written down and may be used in evidence.' He said, 'All right,' and a minute afterwards he said, 'What was the actual verdict?' And I said, 'The jury unanimously found that your late wife died from acute arsenical poisoning and that the poison was administered by you.' He said, 'Oh dear.' The trial took place on the 2nd of November 1920, roughly 18 months after Mabel's death, and lasted 7 days. The story was keenly followed by the press. Although the case from the villagers' standpoint was a foregone conclusion, Greenwood had hired a renowned defence barrister, Sir Edward Marshall Hall, known as the Great Defender. The supposed motive, other than moving to a newer model of wife, was money. However, it was found that this was not as straightforward as had been expected. His own income from his practice was poor and would have been difficult to live on. Mabel's annual income of £700 to £800, worth roughly £50,000 in 2023, allowed for a comfortable lifestyle. But upon Mabel's death, those shares were passed to the children. Greenwood had no access to any of the money and was now in a considerably poorer position financially from Mabel's death than he would have been if she was still living. From the Coventry Evening Telegraph, 9th of November, 1920. The Trial of Harold Greenwood. 2 points to consider. The jury had to consider 2 questions. 1. Was there any arsenic found in the body? Not a trace, merely, but an appreciable quantity. They had the evidence of the experts on that point. It had been contended that an American textbook recommended an examination of the whole of the organs, but the best scientific men in this country had adopted the practice of taking a small portion of the organs and examining them. The second question which they had to consider was, did the prisoner give the deceased the arsenic? That was the real difficulty, or he would say a real difficulty in this case. It was for the prosecution to make it out to their satisfaction. The theory with which the case was opened was that the arsenic found its way into this lady's mouth in a glass of wine consumed at lunch. Then came the question of motive. The existence of a motive was no proof of crime, but it coloured the evidence. In this case, there was no financial motive. The wife had an income which passed to the children on her death. Her husband enjoyed a share of the income, and the children might share it with their father, but it was not on the same footing. The children might wish to get married or to spend their own money. The motive alleged by the Crown was animal passion, to use a strong expression. His wife, aged 47, was in poor health, and it was suggested that he had had a strong desire for Gladys Jones, who was a young and attractive woman. The prosecution case. The prosecution case was Greenwood was motivated to kill his wife due to his obsession with Miss Gladys Jones. Greenwood's opportunity was with the strong-tasting Burgundy which he had access to before it was served at the lunch. In February and April 1919, some 2 months before Mabel's untimely death, Harold was known to have bought Cooper's Weedicide, a garden product containing 60% arsenic. It was contended that Greenwood had placed the weed killer in the Burgundy that had accompanied Mabel's last meal. Tests were conducted, and the mixture was certainly found to be odourless and, given the heartiness of the wine, potentially tasteless. Only a half teaspoon within the rich Burgundy would have been required to kill. The prosecution medical expert stated he believed Mabel had died of heart failure due to prolonged vomiting and diarrhea due to arsenical poisoning. He believed Mabel had swallowed at least 2 grains of arsenic within 24 hours of her death. The defence. Greenwood was very ably defended by the then celebrated Sir Edward Marshall Hall, known as the Great Defender. Dr. Griffiths, as expected, came under scrutiny. He was a poor witness and seemed unable to consistently remember what he had given Mabel. He was unable to produce his prescriptions book, and he changed his story as to what he actually had given Mabel. He initially stated that he had given Mabel morphine-based medicine, but a bit later changed this into opium-based medicine. Doubt as to Greenwood's guilt crept in. The defence called in various medical experts who countered that they believed Mabel had died from morphine-based poisoning, followed by acute gastroenteritis due to the gooseberry skins in the gooseberry pie. From the Coventry Evening Telegraph, 9th of November 1920. Arsenic or gooseberry skins? The symptoms of the deceased were consistent with arsenic poisoning. It was suggested that they were also consistent with irritation caused by gooseberry skins. One of the medical witnesses had said that the illness caused by the gooseberry skins would cease when the irritating matter was expelled, and that the effects of arsenic continued until fatal termination. It was also suggested the doctor had made a mistake and given the deceased Fowler's solution, an arsenical compound, in place of bismuth mixture. Objection had been taken to his description of this possibly as a colossal blunder. With conflicting medical evidence, the case hinged on the witnesses. Hannah Williams, the maid. Hannah stated that Greenwood had been in the kitchen pantry for half an hour on the Sunday before the lunch was served, the implication being that he had time to poison the wine. The defence tore little Hannah apart, leaving her in floods of tears. Hannah had changed her story several times during her initial interview with the police. It was thought that she had been influenced by the village feelings of condemnation of Greenwood. Her testimony only increased doubt of guilt, and supporting the underlying contention that Greenwood was a victim of village gossip, with no real proof to substantiate murder. Irene Greenwood, 22. The prosecution case was all over with the evidence of the daughter, Irene Greenwood. She stated that she had had 2 glasses of the Burgundy, whereas her mother had had only 1 glass. She testified that she had not been unwell in the slightest. The verdict. Mr. Justice Shearman strongly warned the jury against bias. From the Coventry Evening Telegraph, 9th of November 1920. Brief address to the jury. Following counsel's speeches yesterday evening, the judge said that before the court adjourned, he would like to address a few words to the jury. It was inevitable when the jury was locked up that they should commune with one another, but he hoped they would not make up their minds until they had heard him on the morrow. If they thought Greenwood intentionally administered arsenic to Mrs. Mabel Greenwood, it must have been done in order to help to shorten her life. If they came to the conclusion that he intentionally did so, they would have to find him guilty, at least of an attempt to murder. If they were not satisfied that there had been such an attempt, there was an end to the whole question. The jury came back with the verdict. We are satisfied on the evidence of this case that a dangerous dose of arsenic was administered to Mabel Greenwood on Sunday, June the 15th, 1919. But we are not satisfied that this was the immediate cause of death. The evidence before us is insufficient and does not conclusively satisfy us as to how and by whom the arsenic was administered. We therefore return a verdict of not guilty. From the Coventry Evening Telegraph on the 9th of November 1920, the scene in court. When the jury gave their verdict, Greenwood's face broke into a smile, and someone sitting near counsel's table rushed forward and shook hands with him. He afterwards walked out of the dock. The acquittal was received with a short outburst of clapping, which was immediately suppressed, the judge observing that if he saw anyone making any dole, he would at once commit him. Questions and aftermath. The verdict left everyone feeling dissatisfied. Was Mabel actually murdered? Or is this just a terrible reaction to gooseberry pie, which impacted her strongly due to her failing health? If she was murdered, who did it? And how did they do it? Regardless of the legal judgment, the village had made their own verdict, and Greenwood was unwanted. A feeling of having been cheated by a slick barrister permeated the village. There was no possibility of Greenwood continuing his life in Kidwelly. Greenwood, with new bride in tow, moved away to Ross-on-Wye, and he changed his name to Mr. Pilkington. But his health was broken. Greenwood faced financial ruin and social stigma that followed him. He had little money and died 9 years later in considerably reduced circumstances.
Further particulars. We end this month's Crime Compilation stories with a new feature we introduced in 2024, our Further Particulars segment. This case from 1906 tells the story of the Lamberhurst ghost as reported in the Kent and Sussex Courier and picked up by the Daily Mail. It seems that a range of Elizabethan cottages are being disturbed by an active poltergeist terrorising the residents. From the Daily Mail, June the 1st, 1906. The Daily Mail investigates the Lamberhurst ghost. Strange, unaccountable things are befalling in the neighbourhood of Lamberhurst in Kent. The villagers who, in the midst of their laughter, exhibit unmistakable symptoms of fear, are convinced that they are sheltering one of the most enterprising, audacious, and mysterious working ghosts recorded in the annals of the unseen. If ghost it be, and the word of the persons chiefly concerned can only be accepted on this point, the visitant has displayed the greatest discrimination in the choice of its field of operations. Lamberhurst is an old-time cluster of cottages, Elizabethan for the most part, lying midway between Horsmondon and Gondhurst. 2 miles further on is the Furnace Mill, owned by Mr. J. C. Playfair, a well-to-do farmer and hop grower. Here the ghost has established its headquarters. Furnace Mill lies in a wooded hollow, 1/4 of a mile from the main road. It is flanked by a darksome lake, in which the tall elms that fringe it cast shadowy reflections. The trickling of a cascade and the calls of birds are the only sounds that disturb the silence. No other dwelling is visible. Altogether an eminently appropriate home for a ghost. Playfoot, a matter-of-fact business-like man, recounted with some reluctance his weird experiences to a Daily Mail representative. For, he said, already the news has got abroad, and last Sunday hundreds of people from the towns and villages for miles around invaded my place to look for the ghost. Whatever the thing may be, he went on, that is playing the very mischief with my place, it operates only in the daytime and under the very noses of myself and other members of the family who are looking out for it. It is important to know that I have not discharged anyone, that this place only be reached by a private road, that the approach of any stranger would be disputed by two watchdogs that would stand on any ceremony, and that I carry in my pockets the keys of the mill, stables, hay rooms, and other buildings. Despite all these precautions, locked and bolted doors swing open. The horses are changed from stable to stable, and are sometimes turned round in their stalls so that their backs are against the mangers, and are often seen to run shivering and startled from their stables into the road. Bales of hay are cut and scattered about the hay rooms. The contents of sacks in the drying room are emptied and changed about, while in the tool house barrels of lime weighing hundredweights are flung down a flight of stairs, and many other strange things happen in rooms that are locked, barred, and bolted. While people watch and listen outside, and the keys are in my pockets, nobody and nothing is ever seen or heard. Thea Playfoot described what was perhaps the strangest manifestations of all. About noon a few days ago, he said, in the presence of my son, I locked and bolted every building in the premises and went into the mill house for dinner. Suddenly I heard a startled cry from the lad and rushed into the yard and saw the door of the drying room only about 10 yards away, wide open. Within the room I heard the shouts of the lad, but before I could reach him, the door silently closed. I seized the handle. The door was locked. My son was a prisoner inside. The key of the room was in my pocket. I unlocked the door and entered the room. Nobody was there except my son, standing on the stairs, frightened and pale. Young Playfoot, a bright lad of about 15 years of age, corroborated this strange story. As soon as I had entered the room, he added, I saw the door closed in a mysterious way. The latch rattles and the lock creaks, but although I stood only a foot or two away, neither the latch nor the lock made the least sound. I could not have believed it if I had not been there, supplemented Mr. Playfoot. A strongman feat performed by the ghost was the overturning of a large water butt, a veritable Sandow from Spiritland. One morning, according to Mr. Playfoot, as he walked near one of the stables, the lock was screwed off. He substituted a bolt. Shortly afterwards, he found that the bolt had been removed and the lock neatly restored to its place. And yet I saw nothing, he said, as he wearily drew his hand across his brow. Mr. Playfoot conducted the Daily Mail representative to one of the stables. The double doors were locked and bolted, and the entrance was spanned by a stout timber bar secured by a hidden fastening designed by the mill owner in a hope circumventing the ghost in the stable was a grey mare. Now, such strange things have happened to this horse, he said, that one day I decided to watch the stable closely. I made everything secure and put the keys in my pocket. Presently, I crossed over from where I was standing and unlocked the stable door. Looked in. The stable was empty, and I found the horse in an adjoining hay room which was padlocked. How the horse got there, how it got through a communicating door scarcely wide enough to allow a man to pass, how it got up the steps, all these things are beyond me. If they had been done by human agency, and I hesitate to believe in ghosts, I must have seen or heard something, for I was only yards away. In ordinary circumstances, the stamp of the horse's hoofs on the wooden floor of the hay room would have reached me beside me. Besides, although the doors must have been unlocked and relocked, I had all the keys in my pocket. It is impossible that there can be duplicates. The police have attempted to investigate the circumstances, but without any result. They are as mystified as Mr. Playfoot. Meanwhile, something like alarm exists amongst the scattered inhabitants of Lamberhurst, Horsmansdon and Gondhurst, and they hope that the ghost, as they firmly believe it to be, will confine its operation to Furnace Mill. That concludes this crime compilation special, Favourite British Edwardian Murder Tales. We really hope that you enjoyed the show. Cheers for watching. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up or subscribe to the channel. You can subscribe by tapping the bell icon. And if you think someone else might enjoy it, we would be really grateful if you could share it with them. It really does help. Thank you ever so much for your support, and we'll see you next time. This is Robin Coles, signing off.